Chapter 1. The Valley of Mist and Memory. Close your eyes. Let the noise of the modern world fade away like morning fog burning off a quiet lake. Feel yourself drifting backward through time, through centuries of concrete and steel, through the Industrial Revolution, through the age of samurai and castles, deeper still into the heart of medieval Japan. The year is 1487. You are standing at the edge of a valley in what is now Shiga Prefecture, though such names mean nothing yet to the people who live here. Before you stretches the Koga Valley, a basin of fertile land surrounded on all sides by mountains that rise like natural fortress walls. The air is cool and carries the scent of cedar, pine, and the rich earth of rice paddies. Morning mist clings to the ground, reluctant to surrender to the climbing sun. In the distance, you can hear the sound of water, countless streams that flow down from the mountains, feeding the land, creating natural moats and barriers that make this place both blessed and isolated. This is Koga, or Koka, as it would later be written when Japanese scholars attempted to standardize the reading of its characters. But to the people who have lived here for generations, it is simply home. A place where the mountains protect, where the land provides, and where survival has always depended on something more than strength alone. You cannot see them, but they are here. Farmers working in distant fields, merchants traveling the narrow mountain paths, warriors training in hidden clearings, families who have called this valley home for so many generations that their origins have blurred into legend. These are the people who will become known to history by many names: shinobi, ninja, shadow warriors, invisible ones. But they do not yet know they will be remembered. They know only the work of the day, the turning of the seasons, and the ancient understanding that in a land of endless war, the clever survive where the strong often perish. The story of the Koga Ninja is not a story of individuals, though we will meet remarkable individuals along the way. It is a story of community, of families bound by geography and necessity, of a culture that emerged from this specific landscape as naturally as the mist emerges from the valleys each morning. It is a story often overshadowed by their more famous rivals from across the mountains in Iga province. Yet it is a story equally complex, equally fascinating, and in many ways, equally tragic. To understand the Koga Ninja, we must first understand the land that shaped them. Let us begin at the beginning, in those forgotten centuries when the first families arrived in this valley, seeking refuge, seeking opportunity, seeking a place where they might build something lasting in a world that seemed determined to tear everything down. Chapter 2. Roots in the Mountain Soil. The origins of the Koga clans are wrapped in the kind of mystery that history both loves and struggles with. There are no clear records, no founding documents that declare, "On this day, the ninja of Koga came into being." Instead, there are fragments, hints, stories passed down through generations that may or may not be true, yet contain within them the essence of truth. The most persistent tradition holds that the roots of Koga's martial culture stretch back to the Heian period, that golden age of Japanese civilization that lasted from 794 to 1185. During these centuries, Kyoto was the undisputed center of culture and power, home to the imperial court, to poets and nobles who spent their days composing elegant verse and their evenings engaging in refined pursuits. But even in this age of culture, there was violence. There were always threats: bandits in the mountains, rebels in the provinces, political rivals who needed to be dealt with quietly. It was during the Heian period that certain families began to specialize in what we might call unconventional warfare. These were not the great samurai clans who would dominate the later medieval period. They were instead families of lower status, retainers, guards, minor nobles, who discovered that there was value in skills beyond the sword. Skills like gathering information, moving unseen, knowing the mountain paths, understanding poisons, medicines, the vulnerabilities of fortifications. Some of these families, according to tradition, found their way to the Koga Valley. Perhaps they were fleeing political purges in the capital. Perhaps they were sent to guard the mountain passes and decided to stay. Perhaps they were simply looking for land to farm and found the valley both beautiful and defensible. Whatever their original reasons, they put down roots in this place, and those roots grew deep. One of the founding legends of Koga involves a man named Koga Saburo, though whether he was a real historical figure or a mythical ancestor is impossible to say with certainty. According to the tale, Saburo was a warrior of considerable skill who fled to the Koga Valley after falling out of favor with his lord in Kyoto. He was not alone. He brought with him other warriors, other families, people who shared his predicament and his desire to start anew. In the valley, these refugees found something unexpected: freedom. Here, beyond the direct control of the court, beyond the watchful eyes of powerful nobles, they could organize themselves as they wished. They could farm the land, yes, but they could also maintain their martial traditions, train their children in the arts of combat and strategy, develop new techniques suited to the mountainous terrain they now called home. Over generations, these families intermarried, formed alliances, developed a shared identity. They came to think of themselves not primarily as subjects of distant lords, but as people of Koga, bound to this land and to each other. This sense of regional identity, of loyalty to place rather than to individual rulers, would become one of the defining characteristics of the Koga Ninja. But the valley did not remain isolated forever. As the Heian period gave way to the Kamakura period in 1185, and then to the Muromachi period in 1336, the political landscape of Japan shifted dramatically. The samurai class rose to dominance. Military power displaced cultural refinement as the source of legitimacy and authority. The country fractured into competing power centers, each ruled by warrior lords more interested in strategy and conquest than poetry and court ritual. In this new world, the families of Koga found themselves valuable once again, but in a different way. The warlords who now competed for dominance needed more than just soldiers. They needed intelligence about their enemies' movements and plans. They needed guides who knew the mountain paths. They needed specialists who could infiltrate castles, set fires, spread misinformation, accomplish objectives that conventional armies could not. The people of Koga, with their generations of accumulated knowledge about unconventional warfare, were uniquely positioned to provide these services. But they were not alone. Across the mountains to the southeast, in Iga province, similar developments were occurring. Similar families with similar skills were organizing themselves, creating their own networks, building their own reputation. The relationship between Koga and Iga would become one of the great dynamics of ninja history. Sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, always aware of each other, always measuring themselves against each other. But in these early centuries, before the great conflicts that would define the Sengoku period, they were simply two regions following parallel paths, two communities of mountain people learning to navigate a world increasingly dominated by war. By the early 1400s, the basic social structure that would characterize Koga for the next 2 centuries was in place. The valley was home to 53 distinct family groups, each with its own territory, its own traditions, its own specialties. These families were organized into a confederation, a loose alliance bound by geography, mutual interest, and the recognition that cooperation offered better odds of survival than going it alone. This confederation was not a government in any conventional sense. There was no single leader, no permanent hierarchy. Instead, decisions were made through councils where family heads would gather to discuss threats, opportunities, and strategies. This decentralized structure made Koga both flexible and resilient. It was difficult for enemies to decapitate the leadership because there was no single head to cut off. It allowed for rapid adaptation because individual families could experiment with new techniques, new approaches, and successful innovations would spread through the network organically. But this structure also created challenges. Unity was always fragile. Family feuds could escalate. Different clans had different interests, different priorities. Maintaining cohesion in the face of external threats required constant negotiation, constant balancing of competing concerns. The families themselves were diverse in their origins and specialties. Some claimed descent from noble lines fallen on hard times. Others traced their ancestry to warrior monks from Mount Hiei, the great Buddhist monastery complex near Kyoto, known for its fierce fighting monks. Still others were simply families of farmers and traders who had lived in the valley for so long that their origins were lost to memory. What united them was not bloodline, but practical necessity and shared culture. They all understood that their prosperity and survival depended on maintaining their reputation for skill, reliability, and discretion. A ninja who betrayed an employer, who talked about completed missions, who failed to deliver on promises, damaged not only his own reputation, but that of his entire family, and, by extension, all of Koga. This emphasis on reputation and reliability would become one of the distinguishing features of the Koga Ninja tradition. While popular culture often portrays ninja as treacherous and amoral, the reality was more complex. Yes, they engaged in deception and subterfuge. That was their profession. But among themselves and with their employers, they operated according to strict codes of conduct. Contracts were honored, secrets were kept, loyalty, once given, was maintained. This was not altruism, it was practical economics. In a world where trust was scarce and valuable, a reputation for trustworthiness was the most valuable asset a ninja clan could possess. It was what allowed them to command premium prices for their services. It was what ensured that powerful lords would continue to employ them rather than simply conscripting peasants to do the dirty work. As the 15th century progressed and Japan slid deeper into civil war, the services of the Koga clans became increasingly sought after. Lords who might once have looked down on such unconventional warriors now competed for their allegiance. The valley that had once been a backwater became a strategic asset, and the families who lived there found themselves at the center of great events, shadows moving through a spotlight they had never sought. But before we follow them into those great events, we must understand more deeply what made them what they were. We must explore the techniques they developed, the training they underwent, the philosophy that guided their actions. We must look at how ordinary people became extraordinary through discipline, dedication, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Shadow Clans. The transformation of the Koga families from mountain dwellers into the legendary shinobi of later centuries was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual evolution spanning generations. It was a process shaped by necessity, refined by experience, and passed down through careful teaching from parent to child, master to student, elder to youth. In the mid-1400s, as the Ashikaga shogunate's authority continued its slow collapse and provincial warlords grew increasingly independent, the demand for specialized military services intensified. Conventional warfare, armies meeting in open battle, samurai dueling according to established protocols, was giving way to something more desperate, more pragmatic. Lords needed advantages. They needed to know what their enemies were planning. They needed to strike at vulnerable points. They needed to create chaos and confusion in enemy ranks. The Koga families recognized this shifting landscape and adapted. What had been informal traditions of mountain warfare and local knowledge began to be systematized, codified, taught with greater rigor. Individual families developed specialties, techniques that were refined and perfected over years of practice and real-world application. The Mochizuki clan, one of the most prominent Koga families, became known for their expertise in explosives and fire starting. They experimented with different mixtures of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter, the components of gunpowder, to create devices that could be used for signaling, for creating diversions, or for actual destruction. They developed techniques for starting fires in specific locations within enemy compounds, choosing targets that would cause maximum disruption while allowing the operative to escape in the resulting chaos. The Koga clan itself, from which the valley took its name, specialized in infiltration and intelligence gathering. They trained their members to move silently through different types of terrain, forests, rocky hillsides, urban environments. They studied the patterns of guard rotations, the vulnerabilities of different types of fortifications, the psychology of watchfulness and complacency. They learned to dress as monks, as merchants, as peasants, to blend into any environment and any social context that a mission might require. The Ukai family became masters of water-based operations. Living near the streams and rivers that flowed through the valley, they developed techniques for underwater infiltration, for breathing through hollow reeds while submerged, for moving goods and people using hidden river routes. They understood the seasonal patterns of water flow, knew where rivers could be forded safely, and where attempting to cross would be suicide. Each family guarded its particular expertise carefully, passing techniques from generation to generation through oral instruction and practical demonstration, rather than written manuals. This was partly for security. Written documents could be captured, could reveal secrets to enemies. But it was also because many of the skills required physical demonstration, hands-on teaching, that could not be adequately conveyed through text alone. Training typically began in childhood, though the intensity and focus varied depending on the child's aptitude and the family's needs. Not every child born into a ninja family would become an operative. The clans needed farmers to work the land, merchants to engage in legitimate trade, artisans to produce tools and weapons. But every child learned the basics: how to move quietly, how to observe carefully, how to keep secrets. For those selected for more intensive training, the education was comprehensive and demanding. Physical conditioning was paramount. A ninja needed to be able to run long distances, to climb walls and trees, to swim in cold water, to go without sleep for extended periods. But physical strength alone was not enough. Flexibility, balance, and endurance were equally important. The training grounds were not formal dojos like those used by samurai, but rather the landscape itself. Students learned to climb by climbing actual cliffs, learned to move silently by traversing actual forests, learned to judge distances and trajectories by throwing actual weapons at actual targets. This practical, environment-based training produced operatives who were adapted to real-world conditions rather than idealized training scenarios. Mental training was equally important. A ninja needed to be able to think quickly, to adapt to changing circumstances, to maintain composure under extreme stress. They practiced memorization techniques, learning to retain complex information, maps, guard schedules, architectural details that might need to be reported days or weeks after observation. They studied human psychology, learning to read body language, to detect deception, to manipulate emotions and expectations. Perhaps most importantly, they learned patience. Unlike the samurai, whose culture celebrated bold, decisive action and honorable death in battle, the ninja tradition valued survival and mission completion above glory. A ninja who killed an enemy in a fair fight but failed to complete the mission was a failure. A ninja who accomplished the objective without anyone ever knowing he was there was a success. This philosophical difference between ninja and samurai culture is crucial to understanding the historical role and reputation of the Koga clans. Samurai society was built on concepts of honor, face, and public reputation. A samurai's worth was measured by his lineage, his lord's status, and his performance in battle. The culture celebrated those who died gloriously, who chose death over dishonor, who made their loyalty visible and spectacular. Ninja culture, by necessity and design, operated according to different values. Success meant invisibility. Honor lay not in public recognition, but in the private knowledge of a job well done, of loyalty maintained even when no one was watching. There was no glory in being captured, no honor in dramatic final stands. There was only the work, the mission, and the return home. This does not mean, as popular culture sometimes suggests, that ninja were without moral codes or loyalty. The evidence suggests quite the opposite. But their loyalty was expressed differently. Their codes operated in a different register. They were loyal to their families, to their employers while under contract, to their word once given. But this loyalty did not require, indeed, it often forbade, the kind of public displays that samurai culture demanded. As the 15th century progressed toward its conclusion, the Koga Confederation grew more organized and more professional. Family heads began meeting regularly to coordinate training standards, to share intelligence about potential employers and enemies, to mediate disputes before they could escalate into blood feuds that might weaken the entire community. These gatherings, held in secret locations within the valley, were remarkable examples of grassroots organization. Remember, there was no hereditary lord ruling over Koga, no external authority imposing structure from above. The Confederation existed purely through consensus, through the recognition by individual families that cooperation served their interests better than competition or isolation. Decisions were made through discussion and negotiation. When employment opportunities arose, when a warlord needed services and approached Koga through intermediaries, the family heads would meet to decide how to respond. Would they accept the contract? Which families would provide the operatives? What price would they demand? How would the rewards be distributed? This collective decision-making process was time-consuming and sometimes frustrating, but it had important advantages. It prevented any single family from dominating the others. It ensured that risks and rewards were distributed relatively equitably. It created a system where individual families had incentives to train their members to high standards, since reputation and results determined which families would be chosen for lucrative contracts. By 1487, the year we began this journey, the Koga Confederation had reached a level of organizational sophistication and professional competence that made it one of the premier shinobi networks in all of Japan. They were not yet legendary, not yet the stuff of stories that would terrify children and fascinate historians centuries later. They were simply very good at what they did, and their services were in high demand in a nation sliding toward its most violent period. But they were not alone in their expertise. Across the mountains in Iga province, similar developments had been occurring. Similar families had been organizing, training, perfecting their arts. And while Koga and Iga had cooperated in the past, had even intermarried and shared techniques, they were also competitors, each seeking to maintain their reputation as the best, the most reliable, the most effective. This rivalry between Koga and Iga would shape both communities in profound ways, driving innovation, maintaining standards, but also creating tensions that would occasionally erupt into conflict. It is time now to look more closely at this relationship, at what made Koga and Iga similar and what made them different, and at how their rivalry became one of the defining dynamics of ninja history. But first, we must understand the structure of Koga more completely. We must meet the 53 families who made up this remarkable confederation, understand their relationships, their territories, their individual characters. For Koga was not a monolith, but a complex ecosystem of families, each contributing to the whole in its own way. Chapter 4. 53 Families, One Purpose. The number 53 holds a special place in Koga history. The Koga no Kuchiura, or 53 Families of Koga, was not merely a population census, but a political and military alliance. A confederation of clans who had pledged mutual defense, cooperation, and collective action in the face of external threats. These 53 families were not equal in size, wealth, or influence. Some were large and prosperous, controlling significant territory and fielding many trained operatives. Others were small, perhaps a single extended family living in a fortified farmhouse. But in the councils of Koga, each family head had a voice, and decisions required broad consensus rather than simple majority vote. The three most powerful families formed an informal leadership triumvirate, though their authority was based on respect and capability rather than hereditary right. These were the Koga, the Mochizuki, and the Ukai clans, families whose expertise, resources, and political acumen made them natural leaders when unity of purpose was required. The Koga clan, as mentioned earlier, specialized in infiltration and intelligence. But they were more than just skilled operatives. They were also diplomats and negotiators. When warlords wished to contract Koga services, they typically approached the Koga family first. The Koga clan heads served as intermediaries, representatives who could speak for the confederation as a whole and who had the political skill to navigate complex negotiations without giving offense or making commitments the other families would not honor. The head of the Koga clan during the late 15th century was a man named Koga Saburo. Whether a direct descendant of the legendary founder or simply someone who adopted that prestigious name is unclear. What is clear from contemporary records is that he was respected by both his fellow clan heads and the warlords who employed them. He understood the precarious position Koga occupied, valuable enough to court, but not powerful enough to protect themselves through military might alone. He negotiated contracts that benefited Koga while avoiding entanglements that might drag the valley into conflicts that were not their own. The Mochizuki family brought different strengths to the leadership triumvirate. Masters of explosives and fire techniques, they were also innovators who constantly experimented with new tools and methods. The Mochizuki compound was part fortress, part laboratory, part training ground. Here, operatives from other families could come to learn the latest techniques, to test new devices, to train with specialists in arts that their own families might not have developed. Mochizuki Izumo, the clan head during this period, was known for his methodical approach to problem-solving. When faced with a difficult mission, he would gather information, experiment with different approaches, test solutions on a small scale before committing to full implementation. This careful, scientific mindset might seem at odds with the popular image of ninja as impulsive and daring, but it was precisely this careful approach that made Koga operatives so effective and so rarely caught. The Ukai family, specialists in water operations, occupied territory along the Daido River and its tributaries. Their expertise was crucial not only for missions involving river infiltration, but also for maintaining supply lines and communication routes that were less vulnerable to interception than road travel. The Ukai family compound included facilities for training in swimming, diving, and underwater combat that were unmatched anywhere in Japan. Beyond these three leading families, the remaining 50 clans each had their roles and specialties. The Ohara family were masters of medicine and poison, maintaining gardens where they cultivated both healing herbs and toxic plants. They trained operatives in the art of poison, how to prepare it, how to administer it in ways that would not be detected, how to make death appear natural, or attribute it to illness rather than foul play. The Iwane family specialized in mountain warfare and climbing techniques. Their territory included some of the most rugged terrain in the valley, and they used this landscape as a training ground. Iwane operatives could scale sheer cliff faces, traverse narrow mountain ridges in darkness, and survive in the highlands with minimal equipment. The Sugitani family were archers of exceptional skill, but their specialty was not the conventional archery of samurai warfare. They focused instead on long-range assassination, on shooting from concealment, on the kind of precision that could take down a target from a distance that made escape almost guaranteed. They experimented with different arrow designs, different bow configurations, seeking always to extend their effective range and improve their accuracy. Each family had its territory within the valley, not vast estates like those controlled by daimyo, but specific areas that they defended, cultivated, and used for training. These territories were marked by subtle signs that meant little to outsiders, but were clearly understood by the residents of Koga. A particular arrangement of stones, a certain pruning of trees, specific crops planted in specific patterns. All these served as markers delineating family boundaries and traditional rights. But boundaries did not mean isolation. The families intermarried frequently, creating dense networks of kinship that reinforced political alliances. A young man from the Iwane family might marry a daughter of the Ohara clan, bringing together mountain warfare expertise and medical knowledge in a single household. Children of such unions might inherit skills from both lineages, becoming exceptionally versatile operatives. These marriage alliances were negotiated carefully, with attention to maintaining balance among the families. A family that accumulated too many advantageous marriages might grow too powerful, might begin to dominate the confederation in ways that other families would resent. The goal was not perfect equality, that was neither possible nor desired, but rather a dynamic equilibrium where each family felt they had a stake in the system's continuation. Children of these families grew up in an environment that was simultaneously pastoral and martial. They worked in the fields, learned to cultivate rice and other crops, participated in the normal rhythms of agricultural life. But they also trained in their families' specialized techniques, learned the histories and legends of the Confederation, absorbed the values and codes that governed their unique way of life. Education was not divided into separate academic and martial components, as it was in samurai society, where formal schooling in Chinese classics might be followed by weapons training. Instead, Koga children learned through integrated experiences. A lesson in herbal medicine might include instruction on which plants could be used to create smoke bombs for diversionary tactics. Training in carpentry taught not only how to build, but also how to identify weak points in enemy structures. Even religious instruction at the local Buddhist temples included teachings on meditation, focus, and the control of fear. All valuable skills for operatives who might need to remain calm in life-threatening situations. The Confederation maintained common facilities that served all 53 families. There were training grounds in remote parts of the valley where operatives could practice without being observed by outsiders. There were armories where weapons and tools were stored and maintained. There were safe houses along the major routes in and out of the valley where operatives returning from missions could rest and receive medical attention if needed. Financial matters were handled collectively as well. When the Confederation accepted a contract, payment would be distributed according to complex formulas that took into account which families provided operatives, what risks they undertook, what expenses they incurred. A portion of every payment went into a common fund that supported the training facilities, maintained the safe houses, and provided support for families of operatives who were killed or captured on missions. This last provision was crucial. The knowledge that their families would be cared for if the worst happened gave operatives confidence to take necessary risks. It also reinforced the collective nature of the enterprise. A mission undertaken by one family was, in a sense, undertaken on behalf of all of them. Disputes inevitably arose. Family feuds over boundaries, over marriage arrangements, over distribution of contracts, over perceived slights and insults. The Confederation had developed mechanisms for resolving these disputes without resorting to violence that might weaken the community. Mediation by respected elders, temporary exchanges of hostages as guarantees of good behavior, formal apologies and compensations. All these tools were used to maintain cohesion. But the Confederation also recognized that some level of competition among families was healthy. Competition drove innovation, maintained training standards, kept families sharp and motivated. The key was to channel competition into productive directions, competing to develop better techniques, to train more skilled operatives, to win more contracts through superior performance, rather than allowing it to devolve into destructive conflict. By the late 15th century, this system had been refined over several generations and was functioning remarkably well. The 53 families of Koga had created something unique in Japanese history, a self-governing military confederation that operated according to principles of consent and mutual benefit, rather than hierarchical authority. But this success brought its own dangers. The more successful Koga became, the more attention it attracted. Powerful warlords might decide that, rather than hiring Koga operatives, it would be simpler to conquer the valley and conscript its population. Rival ninja communities might see Koga as a threat to their own livelihood. And the very decentralized structure that gave Koga flexibility also made it potentially vulnerable to enemies who could exploit divisions among the families. These dangers were not merely theoretical. As we move deeper into the 16th century, as the Sengoku period intensifies, and Japan tears itself apart in an orgy of violence and ambition, the Koga Confederation will face challenges that will test whether their carefully constructed unity can survive the storm. But before we reach those trials, we must understand more deeply what made the Koga Ninja so formidable. We must look at their techniques, their tools, their methods. We must understand not just who they were, but how they did what they did, and why they did it better than almost anyone else. Chapter 5. The Art of Invisible Warfare. The term ninjutsu can be translated as the art of stealth or the art of endurance, but these translations capture only part of its meaning. Ninjutsu was not simply a collection of techniques for sneaking and hiding. It was a comprehensive approach to warfare, intelligence gathering, and survival that integrated physical skills, mental discipline, strategic thinking, and psychological manipulation. For the Koga Ninja, ninjutsu was both science and art, both practical toolkit and philosophical framework. Every technique, every tool, every strategy served the ultimate goal: mission completion with maximum effectiveness and minimum risk. This pragmatic focus distinguished ninja methodology from the more formalized martial traditions of the samurai, which were often as concerned with aesthetic considerations and ritualized conduct as with practical effectiveness. The foundation of ninjutsu was taijutsu, unarmed combat and body skills. But Koga taijutsu was distinctive in its emphasis on evasion, escape, and tactical retreat rather than stand-up fighting. A ninja who found themselves in a fair fight had already failed in some fundamental way. The goal was never to meet enemies on their terms, but to control the terms of engagement so completely that the outcome was never in doubt. Koga training in body skills began with fundamental conditioning. Operatives needed stamina to travel long distances on foot, strength to climb and carry equipment, flexibility to move through confined spaces, and maintain concealment in uncomfortable positions for extended periods. But the training went beyond general fitness to develop highly specific capabilities. Take, for example, the practice of walking silently. This sounds simple, but effective silent movement is remarkably complex. It requires understanding how different surfaces transmit sound: gravel versus wood, wet leaves versus dry, packed earth versus loose soil. It requires awareness of one's own body, where weight is distributed, how clothing moves and rustles, how breath sounds in quiet environments. Koga operatives trained to walk with a distinctive gait that minimized sound. They learned to place their feet carefully, rolling from outside edge to inside, testing weight distribution before committing to each step. They practiced on progressively more difficult surfaces, eventually reaching a point where they could cross a room of dry leaves or loose boards without making noise that would alert someone in an adjacent space. Similar attention was paid to climbing. Koga territory included mountains and rough terrain, and operatives were expected to be able to traverse vertical surfaces with minimal equipment. They trained on cliffs and trees, learning to read rock and bark for handholds and footholds, developing the strength and technique to climb quickly and silently. But ninja climbing techniques differed from modern rock climbing in important ways. Modern climbers focus on safety and efficiency, using ropes and equipment, climbing in daylight. Ninja climbers needed to ascend and descend at night, often in adverse weather, while carrying equipment, with no safety systems and no room for error. They developed techniques for testing holds by sound and feel, for distributing weight across multiple points of contact to minimize the chance of dislodging stones or breaking branches.
The ninjas' arsenal of weapons and tools was extensive and specialized. While they trained in conventional weapons, swords, spears, bows, their true expertise lay in implements designed for their specific mission requirements. The shuriken, those famous throwing stars of popular culture, were indeed part of the ninja toolkit, but their purpose was often misunderstood. They were rarely used for killing, which would require improbable accuracy and luck. Instead, they served as distraction devices, thrown to make noise, to force enemies to take cover, to create opportunities for escape or further action. Some shuriken were designed to be embedded in wood or earth, where they would serve as climbing aids for return trips. The kunai, often described as throwing knives, were actually multi-purpose tools. Yes, they could be thrown or used as weapons in close combat, but they were equally useful as digging implements, pry bars, or climbing spikes. The versatility of tools was crucial for operatives who needed to travel light while being prepared for unpredictable situations. Grappling hooks and rope were essential for scaling walls and crossing gaps. The Koga Ninja developed sophisticated rope techniques, including methods for quickly deploying and retrieving ropes, for creating climbing aids that could be used by multiple operatives in sequence, and for using rope to create diversionary sounds at a distance. But perhaps the most distinctive element of the ninja arsenal was the variety of devices used to create confusion, misdirection, and opportunity. Smoke bombs made from mixtures of sulfur and other chemicals could create cover for escape or approach. Flash powders could temporarily blind enemies. Caltrops, small, multi-pointed metal devices that always landed with a spike pointing upward, could be scattered behind fleeing operatives to discourage pursuit. The Koga Ninja were also skilled in the use of fire as both weapon and tool. They understood how to start fires quickly using flint and steel, tinder, and accelerants. They knew how to judge wind direction and structural vulnerabilities to determine where a fire would spread most effectively. They could create incendiary devices that would ignite on a delay, allowing them to be far away when the flames began. But fire was a weapon to be used with great care. Uncontrolled fire could kill innocents, destroy valuable resources, create chaos that made mission completion impossible. Koga operatives were trained to use fire precisely and sparingly, as a scalpel rather than a hammer. Disguise and impersonation were crucial elements of ninja tradecraft. The ability to move through enemy territory without arousing suspicion often depended on looking like you belonged there. Koga operatives maintained collections of clothing appropriate to different roles and regions. The robes of Buddhist monks, the garments of traveling merchants, the simple clothes of peasants and laborers. But effective disguise was about more than clothing. It required understanding the behavior patterns, speech patterns, and mannerisms of whoever you were impersonating. A ninja disguised as a monk needed to know Buddhist prayers and rituals, to understand the schedules and routines of monastic life, to move and speak with the bearing of someone who had spent years in religious devotion. Koga families accumulated extensive knowledge about different occupations and social roles. Operatives would sometimes apprentice themselves to actual merchants or craftspeople, learning trades thoroughly enough to pass as genuine practitioners. This knowledge was valuable not only for disguise, but also for understanding the worlds they moved through. Knowing what questions a merchant would ask, what prices would seem reasonable, what behaviors would attract attention or suspicion. The psychological dimensions of ninjutsu were as important as the physical techniques. Koga operatives were trained to read people, to understand motivations and vulnerabilities, to manipulate through calculated interactions rather than force. They studied the principle of kiai, the use of spirit and energy to influence others. This could be as simple as projecting confidence to make guards less likely to challenge you, or as complex as creating elaborate deceptions that played on enemies' fears and expectations. They understood the power of patience. A ninja might spend days or weeks establishing a cover identity, building relationships, positioning themselves for a single moment of opportunity. The ability to wait, to endure boredom and discomfort without losing focus, was as valuable as any fighting technique. They learned to control fear. Fear is useful. It heightens senses, quickens reflexes, keeps you alert. But uncontrolled fear leads to panic, to mistakes, to capture or death. Koga training included mental exercises derived from Buddhist meditation practices, techniques for maintaining calm awareness even in terrifying circumstances. Intelligence-gathering techniques were perhaps the most important and least dramatic element of ninja skills. The Koga specialized in building information networks, cultivating sources, establishing communication systems, collecting and analyzing information from multiple channels. This might involve recruiting informants among the servants and merchants who moved through enemy territory. It might mean establishing legitimate businesses that served as covers for intelligence operations. It might require developing codes and signal systems for communicating over distances without arousing suspicion. The Koga were masters of observational skills. They trained their operatives to notice and remember details: the number of guards at a fortress, their rotation schedules, the layout of buildings, the locations of wells and stores of food and weapons. An operative might spend only a few hours in an enemy compound, but would return with information that could be used to plan attacks or sieges weeks or months later. They also understood the importance of corroboration and verification. Information from a single source might be wrong or deliberately misleading. Koga operatives were taught to seek multiple sources, to cross-check information, to look for patterns and inconsistencies that might reveal deception or error. As the 16th century dawned and the Sengoku period intensified, these skills became increasingly valuable and increasingly sought after. The Koga Ninja found themselves at the center of great events, their services in demand by the most powerful men in Japan. But this success would bring them into collision with their rivals from Iga, and that collision would shape the destiny of both communities in ways neither could have foreseen. Chapter 6. Rivals across the mountains. The mountains that separated Koga and Iga were not impossibly high, not uncrossable barriers. A determined traveler could make the journey in less than a day, yet these mountains formed a cultural and psychological divide between two communities that were remarkably similar in many ways, yet distinct in others. Similar enough to be natural rivals, different enough to maintain separate identities. Iga province, like Koga, was mountainous territory that bred independence and fostered unconventional martial traditions. The families of Iga had followed a parallel path to those of Koga, developing similar skills in response to similar circumstances. Both communities traced their origins to the same historical period, the same influx of displaced warriors and masterless samurai seeking refuge in the mountains during times of political upheaval. But from these similar origins, subtle differences had emerged. If Koga was characterized by its confederation of 53 families operating through consensus, Iga was dominated by three great clans: the Hattori, Momochi, and Fujibayashi, who divided the province among themselves and commanded the loyalty of smaller families in their respective territories. This more hierarchical structure gave Iga certain advantages. Decisions could be made more quickly, without the need for extensive consultation among dozens of family heads. The three great clans could mobilize larger forces more rapidly than Koga's more decentralized confederation. In matters requiring unified command and rapid response, Iga had the edge. But Koga's structure had its own strengths. The 53 families created redundancy and resilience. The confederation could absorb losses that might cripple a more centralized organization. The diversity of specializations across many families meant that Koga operatives, collectively, had a broader range of skills and capabilities than any single Iga clan could match. The relationship between Koga and Iga oscillated between cooperation and competition. In the early days, when both communities were still developing their capabilities, there had been considerable exchange. Koga families had married into Iga clans and vice versa. Techniques had been shared. Operatives from one region had sometimes trained in the other. But as both communities became more professional, as they began competing for the same contracts from the same employers, the relationship grew more strained. A warlord seeking to hire shinobi operatives might approach both Koga and Iga, and whichever community offered better terms or demonstrated superior capabilities would win the contract. This created a competitive dynamic that drove both communities to constantly improve their skills and methods, but also bred resentment and rivalry. The rivalry was not purely economic. There was also an element of pride, of identity, of each community seeing itself as the true masters of ninjutsu and viewing the other as upstarts or inferiors. Iga operatives might speak dismissively of Koga's committee warfare, suggesting that decision by consensus led to timidity and missed opportunities. Koga operatives might counter that Iga's hierarchical structure bred sycophancy and stifled innovation, with smaller families afraid to challenge the dominance of the great clans. These rivalries occasionally erupted into violence. Skirmishes between Koga and Iga operatives working for opposing employers were not uncommon. More seriously, there were episodes where the communities came into direct conflict over territory or insults to honor. These clashes were usually limited in scope. Neither community wanted a full-scale war that might weaken both and create opportunities for outside forces to conquer them. But they were bitter and left lasting resentments. One such incident occurred in 1487, the year where our story began. A Koga operative named Iwane Sakon had been captured by forces loyal to the Rokaku clan, one of the powerful families that controlled territory near the Koga Valley. Under torture, Sakon had revealed information about Koga's operational methods. Not specific mission details, which would have been dishonorable, but general techniques that gave the Rokaku insight into how Koga operatives functioned. The Koga Confederation was outraged, not just at the Rokaku, but at Sakon for breaking under torture. There was debate about how to respond. Some families wanted to send a mission to rescue Sakon, despite the risks. Others wanted to disavow him, to declare him no longer part of Koga, and therefore not their responsibility. Still others wanted to send a mission not to rescue him, but to silence him permanently, to prevent further revelations. Before Koga could act, however, The situation was resolved by an unexpected party, the Iga Ninja. A team led by Momochi Sandayu, one of the great clan heads of Iga, infiltrated the Rokaku compound and killed Sakon. They left evidence suggesting that the killing was retaliation for Sakon's betrayal, not a rescue attempt gone wrong. The Iga action was ambiguous in its motivations. On one hand, it prevented further damage to the reputation of shinobi communities in general. If employers believed that ninja would break under torture and reveal secrets, both Iga and Koga would find it harder to win contracts. By demonstrating that betrayal would be punished, Iga had reinforced the code that kept the whole system functioning. On the other hand, the Iga action had humiliated Koga. Iga had resolved a Koga problem before Koga could act, making Koga look weak and slow. Worse, Iga had demonstrated superior operational capability. They had infiltrated and struck while Koga was still debating what to do. This incident deepened the rivalry and sparked a period of intense competition between the communities. Koga families redoubled their training efforts, refined their techniques, sought to demonstrate that they were not inferior to their Iga rivals. Contracts that might once have been shared or divided between the communities became winner-take-all competitions, where Koga and Iga bid against each other, sometimes offering their services at rates that barely covered costs, just to deny the contract to their rivals. Yet even in rivalry, there was a strange form of respect. Koga and Iga Ninja understood each other in ways that outsiders could never comprehend. They lived similar lives, faced similar challenges, operated according to similar codes. When they met in neutral territory, there was often a complex mixture of hostility and recognition, of antagonism and professional regard. There were also still connections between the communities, despite the rivalry. Marriages made in earlier, friendlier times meant that many families had relatives on both sides of the mountains. These kinship ties created unofficial channels of communication, ways for the communities to coordinate when their interests aligned, despite their general rivalry. And their interests did sometimes align, particularly when faced with threats from outside. Both Koga and Iga understood that they were vulnerable to conquest by powerful warlords. Both communities benefited from maintaining the fiction that they were more formidable than they actually were, that attacking either community would be prohibitively costly. When threats emerged that might tempt warlords to attempt conquest, Koga and Iga sometimes cooperated, sharing intelligence, coordinating responses, presenting a united front. One of the key figures in managing this complex relationship was Koga Saburo, the clan head we met earlier. Saburo understood that rivalry with Iga could be productive, driving both communities to excellence, but that it needed to be managed carefully to prevent it from becoming destructive. He maintained back-channel communications with his counterparts in Iga, particularly with Fujibayashi Nagato, one of the leaders of Iga's three great clans. These communications allowed the communities to coordinate on matters of common interest while continuing to compete for contracts. It was a delicate balance, requiring trust and pragmatism on both sides. The fact that it worked as well as it did is a testament to the political sophistication of both communities. But the rivalry also had costs. Resources devoted to outdoing Iga might have been better spent on other priorities. Operatives killed in clashes with Iga rivals were losses that weakened both communities. The constant pressure to demonstrate superiority sometimes led to taking on missions that were too risky, to cutting corners in planning, to prioritizing prestige over practical considerations. As the 16th century progressed and the Sengoku period intensified, both Koga and Iga would be tested in ways that would determine whether their rivalry would destroy them both, or whether they could find a way to coexist and even cooperate in the face of greater threats. But before we reach those crucial moments, we must understand more about how these communities actually functioned on a day-to-day basis, how they turned their skills into services that warlords were willing to pay for, and how they maintained the networks and capabilities that made them so valuable. Chapter 7. Masters of Intelligence and Deception. The popular image of ninja tends to focus on dramatic moments, infiltrations, assassinations, escapes. But the reality was that most ninja work was far less theatrical. It was patient, methodical intelligence gathering, the kind of work that required dedication and discipline rather than acrobatic skill. For the Koga Ninja, intelligence work was the core of their profession. Warlords in Sengoku Japan operated in an environment of radical uncertainty. They needed to know what their rivals were planning, what resources they commanded, what vulnerabilities they had. They needed to know which allies were loyal and which were preparing to betray them. They needed to understand the political currents in Kyoto, the movements of armies, the availability of supplies and weapons. This information was valuable, more valuable often than any military action. A warlord who knew that his enemy was planning an attack could prepare defenses, set ambushes, turn the enemy's strategy against them. A warlord who knew that a rival's alliance was fragile could work to fracture it, turning enemies against each other rather than having to fight them directly. Koga families developed sophisticated methods for gathering this kind of strategic intelligence. The process typically began with open source collection, gathering information that was publicly available but scattered across many sources. Traveling merchants brought news from other provinces. Monks returning from pilgrimages carried gossip from temples and way stations. Farmers who sold goods in market towns returned with rumors and observations. The Koga Confederation maintained a network of collectors who would gather this open-source information, looking for patterns and signals in the noise. An increase in merchants buying rice in a particular region might indicate an army preparing to march. Reports of increased activity at a temple might signal that a warlord was seeking religious legitimacy for a planned action. Observations about which daimyo were sending representatives to meet with which other daimyo could reveal alliance formations before they became public. But open-source information was never enough. It provided context and clues, but rarely revealed secrets that enemies were actively trying to conceal. For that, more direct methods were required. Koga operatives used several approaches to penetrate the security around sensitive information. One was infiltration, placing operatives inside enemy organizations where they could observe and report. This was a long-term strategy that required patience and careful preparation. An operative might be inserted into an enemy household as a servant, a craftsperson, or even as a low-ranking retainer. The insertion itself required careful backstopping, creating a plausible personal history, establishing references, ensuring that nothing about the operative would arouse suspicion. Once inserted, the operative would need to perform their cover role convincingly, while remaining alert for opportunities to gather intelligence. This kind of penetration operation could last months or even years. The operative might rise through the ranks of the household, gaining access to progressively more sensitive information. They would need to maintain their cover constantly, building genuine relationships with people they might one day betray, all while secretly memorizing details, eavesdropping on conversations, observing patterns. Communication between the embedded operative and their handlers in Koga was one of the most delicate aspects of these operations. Messages had to be passed in ways that would not arouse suspicion. Dead drops, predetermined locations where messages could be left and retrieved, were common. These might be as simple as a hollow tree or a loose brick in a wall, or as elaborate as a legitimate business that served as a front for intelligence operations. The Koga Ninja developed codes and cryptographic methods to protect the content of messages, even if they were intercepted. Some of these were simple substitution ciphers, where each character was replaced with another according to a predetermined key. Others were more sophisticated, using techniques that would not be out of place in modern intelligence agencies. One particularly clever method involved using apparently innocent letters or documents, where the real message was hidden in the text. The operative and their handler would agree in advance on a system, perhaps every seventh word, or the first character of each line, or characters marked with nearly invisible scratches. To anyone inspecting the document, it would appear to be nothing more than a personal letter or business correspondence. Only someone who knew the system would be able to extract the hidden message. Another approach to intelligence gathering was the use of specialized interrogators. When important prisoners were captured, or when there was reason to suspect that someone possessed valuable information, Koga specialists might be called in to conduct interrogations. These interrogators were not simply thugs who used torture, though physical coercion was certainly in their toolkit. More often, they were skilled psychologists who understood how to manipulate through a sophisticated mixture of threat and reward, isolation and companionship, fear and hope. They knew how to build rapport with subjects, to make them want to share information, to create conditions where betrayal felt like the only reasonable option. The ethics of these practices were complex. The Koga Ninja operated in a world where the alternatives to their methods were often worse. Conventional warfare that killed thousands, sieges that starved entire populations, political instability that led to chaos and suffering. From their perspective, intelligence work that prevented large-scale violence was morally justified, even if individual actions were distasteful. But they also understood that certain lines should not be crossed. Gratuitous cruelty was forbidden, not only because it was wrong, but because it was counterproductive. People subjected to extreme torture would say anything to make it stop, providing worthless information just to satisfy their tormentors. Skilled interrogation required finesse, required understanding human psychology and motivation, required giving subjects reasons to cooperate that went beyond immediate fear. Deception operations were another crucial element of Koga intelligence work. If gathering information was valuable, shaping what enemies believed was equally so. Feeding false intelligence to enemy spies, spreading rumors designed to sow discord among enemy alliances, creating deceptions that would cause enemies to waste resources preparing for threats that did not exist, all these were part of the shinobi toolkit. One classic deception technique was the double agent. If Koga discovered that one of their operatives had been compromised, or that an enemy had planted a spy in their network, rather than simply eliminating the threat, they might turn the situation to their advantage. The compromised operative or enemy spy would be allowed to continue operating, but would now be fed false information designed to mislead the enemy. This required careful management. The false information had to be plausible enough to be believed, but significant enough to cause the enemy to make strategic errors. Too obvious, and the enemy would realize they were being deceived. Too subtle, and it would have no effect. The art lay in crafting deceptions that would seem to confirm what enemies already suspected, reinforcing their misconceptions rather than challenging them. The Koga Confederation maintained specialists in what we might call information warfare, operatives whose primary expertise was not in physical infiltration, but in psychological operations, propaganda, and deception. These specialists understood how information flowed through medieval Japanese society, knew which channels were most likely to carry rumors effectively, could predict how different audiences would react to different messages. They might spread rumors about the health of an enemy lord, creating uncertainty and potentially triggering succession struggles. They might fabricate evidence of betrayal, causing a warlord to turn against loyal retainers. They might create false intelligence about enemies' strength or intentions, causing miscalculation and strategic errors. These operations were risky. If the deception was discovered, it could backfire spectacularly, hardening enemy resolve and damaging the credibility of the Koga Confederation. But when executed skillfully, information warfare could achieve objectives that would have been impossible through conventional military means. The line between intelligence gathering and sabotage was often blurred. An operative gathering information in an enemy compound might notice opportunities for disruption that could be exploited with minimal additional risk. A contaminated well, a fire in a critical storage facility, a loosened saddle girth on a commander's horse. Small actions that might seem like accidents, but could have cascading effects. The Koga Ninja were trained to be opportunistic, to recognize and exploit chances that presented themselves, even if they had not been part of the original mission plan. But they were also trained to exercise judgment, to weigh the potential benefits of opportunistic action against the risks of compromising their primary mission or their cover. As we move deeper into the 16th century, these intelligence capabilities would become increasingly important. The Sengoku period was reaching its most chaotic phase, with literally hundreds of daimyo competing for power, alliances forming and dissolving with bewildering rapidity, and the fate of individuals and families changing with each season's campaign. In this environment, the Koga Ninja's skills in intelligence and deception would be tested as never before, and their choices would help shape the outcome of conflicts that determined the future of Japan. But tools and techniques are only as effective as the people who wield them. Before we follow the Koga Ninja into the great conflicts that would define their legacy, we must understand better the human dimension of their work, who these people actually were, how they lived, how they maintained their humanity while engaged in work that often required them to deceive, manipulate, and kill. Chapter 8. The Tools of Survival. In the quiet moments before dawn, in workshops scattered throughout the Koga Valley, craftspeople worked by lamplight, creating the tools that operatives would carry into darkness and danger. These workshops were not grand armories, but humble spaces, often indistinguishable from the workshops of ordinary farmers and artisans. Yet what was produced here was anything but ordinary. The relationship between ninja and their tools was intimate and practical. Unlike the samurai, who might treasure a sword as much for its beauty and historical pedigree as for its function, ninja valued tools primarily for their effectiveness, reliability, and versatility. A ninja's tools needed to work in adverse conditions, to serve multiple purposes, to be easily concealed and transported. The shinobi shozoko, the common ninja outfit of popular culture, was actually far less uniform than movies suggest. The iconic black outfit is more myth than reality. Black is highly visible at night against most backgrounds. Navy blue or dark grey was more common for nocturnal operations. But more often, operatives wore clothing appropriate to their cover identity and mission requirements. A ninja impersonating a monk wore monk's robes. A ninja posing as a farmer wore farmer's clothes. What distinguished ninja clothing was the attention to functional details. Garments were designed with hidden pockets for carrying small tools and documents. Fabric was chosen for quietness of movement as well as durability. Reinforced patches at knees and elbows accommodated crawling and climbing. The hakama, the traditional pleated pants worn by many operatives, had wider legs than normal, allowing for greater freedom of movement. Footwear was particularly important. The tabi boots associated with ninja had separated toes, allowing for better grip and sensitivity when climbing. The soles were thin enough to permit feeling texture and finding footholds, yet tough enough to protect feet during long journeys. Some versions had spikes that could be attached for climbing or traversing ice. But beyond clothing, the operative's toolkit included an array of specialized implements, each chosen for specific mission requirements. Let us examine some of these tools more closely. understanding not just what they were, but how they were actually used in practice. The katana, the curved sword associated with samurai, was sometimes carried by ninja, but more often they preferred the ninjato, a shorter, straight-bladed sword. The straight blade was easier to manufacture, easier to conceal, and more versatile as a tool. The ninjato could be used as a climbing aid, with the scabbard driven into soil or jammed into crevices to create handholds. The guard could serve as a step. The blade itself, though primarily a weapon, could also be used to pry open doors, to dig, to cut rope and fabric. The ninjato was typically worn across the back rather than at the waist like a samurai sword. This was practical for infiltration. A sword on the back was less likely to catch on obstacles when crawling or climbing. It also made the draw less visible in darkness, as the motion of drawing from the back kept the blade close to the body rather than extending it outward. Smaller blades were equally important. The tanto, a short knife, was a versatile tool carried by virtually every operative. It could be used for close combat, certainly, but also for 100 mundane tasks: cutting rope, preparing food, basic carpentry, creating distractions by throwing to make noise. The tanto was often a ninja's most used tool, the implement they would reach for first when confronted with an unexpected problem. Rope was essential equipment. The Koga Ninja developed sophisticated rope techniques that went far beyond simple climbing. They used specific types of rope made from different materials: hemp, silk, cotton, depending on requirements. Hemp rope was strong and durable, but rough. Silk rope was smoother and less likely to leave abrasions on hands during rapid descent, but more expensive. Cotton rope held knots well and had good grip, but was vulnerable to water damage. Ninja rope techniques included methods for rapidly ascending and descending, for creating climbing aids that could be used by multiple operatives in sequence, for fashioning rope into improvised ladders, bridges, and snares. They developed knots that could be tied and untied quickly, even in darkness or while wearing gloves. They practiced ascending and descending until they could do so silently, without the rope scraping against walls or creating vibrations that might alert guards. The kaginawa, a grappling hook attached to rope, was one of the iconic ninja tools, and for good reason. A well-thrown kaginawa could hook over a wall, creating an instant climbing route. It could be used to pull objects, to create distractions, to cross gaps. The Koga Ninja experimented with different grappling hook designs, seeking the optimal balance between weight — it needed to be thrown high and far; strength — it needed to bear a person's weight; and quietness. Metal striking stone makes noise that carries surprisingly far at night. Some kaginawa were wrapped in cloth or had rubber-like padding made from tree sap to muffle the sound of impact. Others were designed to fold or collapse for easier transport. The most skilled operatives could throw a kaginawa accurately in darkness, judging distance and trajectory by feel and experience, hooking the target on the first throw, important because repeated attempts increased the chances of detection. Climbing aids extended beyond rope and hooks. The shuko and ashiko were hand and foot claws, metal bands with spikes that could be worn to assist in scaling wooden surfaces. They left marks, making them unsuitable for covert infiltrations where evidence of intrusion needed to be minimized. But they were invaluable when speed was more important than stealth. The fukiya, a blowgun, was used not for poison darts, as fiction often suggests, but primarily for delivering irritants and distractions. A dart with a barbed tip dipped in irritating substances could create a commotion when it struck a guard or a horse. The fukiya was silent and could be used from considerable distances, making it ideal for creating diversions that drew attention away from the operative's actual position. Smoke and flash devices were crucial tools for escape and distraction. The Koga Ninja were experts in mixing chemicals to produce different effects. Some mixtures produced thick, dark smoke that obscured vision and provided cover for escape. Others produced colored smoke that could serve as signals visible at great distances. Flash powders, when ignited, created brief but intense light that could temporarily blind anyone looking in that direction. Precious seconds that could mean the difference between capture and escape. These devices were typically contained in small ceramic or bamboo vessels with fuses. The operative would light the fuse and throw the device, then move immediately, using the seconds before detonation to create distance. The best devices were designed to detonate with a distinctive sound, a pop or crack, that was startling enough to divert attention, but not so loud as to raise general alarm. Caltrops, the tetsubishi, were simple but brutally effective area denial weapons. These small metal devices, usually with 4 spikes arranged so one always pointed upward, could be scattered behind fleeing operatives to discourage pursuit. Stepping on a caltrop was intensely painful and potentially incapacitating. Even if pursuers saw them, clearing a path through a scattered field of caltrops took time. Time the operative could use to escape. Medicine and poison knowledge was another crucial element of the ninja toolkit, though the operatives themselves typically carried only basic supplies. The Ohara family, as specialists in this area, maintained much more extensive pharmacopoeias. They cultivated gardens with both medicinal and toxic plants, understanding which could be used for healing and which for harm. Medicinal knowledge was vital for operatives who might be injured far from friendly territory. They carried basic medical supplies, clean cloth for bandaging, herbal preparations that could prevent infection, substances that could numb pain. They knew which plants growing wild could be used in emergencies, which barks and roots had healing properties. Poison knowledge was more controversial. The use of poison was considered dishonorable in samurai culture, yet it was sometimes the only practical means of accomplishing a mission. The Koga Ninja approached poison pragmatically, viewing it as one tool among many, to be used when appropriate. Poisons used by ninja were typically not the fast-acting, dramatic toxins of fiction. More often, they were substances that would cause symptoms resembling natural illness, allowing assassination to be accomplished without obviously pointing to murder. A lord who died suddenly in dramatic fashion would trigger investigations, might lead to discovery. A lord who sickened gradually, showing symptoms consistent with common diseases, was much less likely to arouse suspicion. The preparation and administration of poison required expertise. Dosage had to be precise. Too little would be ineffective. Too much might produce symptoms that obviously indicated poisoning. Delivery methods had to be carefully chosen based on the situation. Some poisons could be mixed into food or drink. Others could be absorbed through skin contact. Still others required injection, limiting them to situations where the operative could get close to the target. Beyond weapons and tools, ninja carried various implements for specific mission requirements. Lockpicks for bypassing security, writing materials for documenting intelligence, flint and steel for starting fires, climbing spikes, breathing tubes for underwater approach, small mirrors for seeing around corners without exposing oneself. Each mission required careful planning to determine which tools to carry. Too few, and the operative might lack something crucial. Too many, and the weight would slow movement, and the bulk would make concealment difficult. The principle was always versatility and redundancy. A tool that could serve only one purpose was less valuable than one that could serve multiple purposes. And critical capabilities should never depend on a single tool that might be lost or broken. If rope was essential, carry backup. If fire starting was crucial, carry multiple means of creating flame. The Koga craftspeople who created these tools were themselves highly valued members of the community. They experimented constantly, seeking to improve existing designs and develop new capabilities. They tested materials, refined manufacturing techniques, incorporated ideas from other regions and other cultures. This spirit of innovation was one of Koga's great strengths. Unlike more tradition-bound martial cultures where change came slowly and innovation was viewed with suspicion, the Koga Ninja embraced new ideas that proved themselves in practice. If a new tool design worked better than the old, it would be adopted. If a technique from China or Korea offered advantages, it would be learned and integrated. As the 16th century progressed, this innovative spirit would serve the Koga Ninja well, helping them adapt to changing circumstances and new challenges. But tools and techniques alone would not be enough to navigate the storms that were coming. The true strength of the Koga community lay not in their arsenal, but in their people, and particularly in those who have often been overlooked by history, the women who served as ninja, who developed their own techniques, who played crucial roles that conventional histories have frequently ignored or minimized. Chapter 9. Women in the Shadows. The history of ninja has been, like much of traditional martial history, dominated by male narratives. Yet the truth is more complex and more interesting. Women played significant roles in the intelligence and unconventional warfare activities of the Koga clans, roles that were different from men's, but equally important, equally demanding, and equally dangerous. In the rigid social structure of Sengoku period Japan, women had restricted official roles. They could not be samurai in the formal sense, could not hold official positions in most hierarchies, could not operate openly in most spheres of public life. But these very restrictions created opportunities for intelligence work, because women moved through spaces and social contexts that were closed to men. The female ninja, sometimes called kunoichi, though this term is of uncertain historical authenticity, exploited the blind spots in male-dominated society. Guards who would carefully scrutinize any man approaching a castle might wave through a woman carrying supplies. Men who would never discuss sensitive matters in front of male servants might speak freely in front of female servants, assuming women lacked the intelligence or interest to understand what they were hearing. This systematic underestimation of women created vulnerabilities that the Koga clans learned to exploit. But doing so required training women to fill these roles, and that training was both similar to and different from that given to male operatives. Physical conditioning for female operatives emphasized flexibility, endurance, and skills like climbing and swimming, just as male training did. But there was also emphasis on different skill sets. Female operatives trained extensively in social manipulation, in reading people, in the kind of interpersonal intelligence that was crucial for long-term infiltration operations. A female operative inserted into an enemy household as a servant or concubine might spend months or years in that role, gradually gaining trust, rising in status within the household, gaining access to progressively more sensitive information. This required remarkable psychological strength, the ability to maintain a false identity indefinitely, to build genuine relationships while never forgetting that those relationships were ultimately means to an end, to endure situations that might be degrading or dangerous while never breaking character. The most successful female operatives were those who could make their targets want to confide in them. A male operative might gather intelligence through eavesdropping and observation, but a skilled female operative could position herself as a confidant, someone in whom lonely or troubled men would confide, sharing information they would never consciously reveal to a spy. This required deep understanding of human psychology and exceptional acting ability. The operative needed to seem genuinely interested, genuinely sympathetic, genuinely trustworthy. She needed to remember every detail she was told, while never appearing to pay too close attention. She needed to gently guide conversations toward topics of intelligence value without making her interest obvious. Training for these roles included extensive instruction in the social graces, arts, and accomplishments expected of women in different social classes. An operative who might be inserted as a servant needed to know how to perform household tasks convincingly. One who might pose as a courtesan needed training in music, conversation, and entertainment arts. One who might be introduced as a lady-in-waiting needed to understand court protocol and aristocratic manners. The Koga clans maintained specialized training houses where female operatives could practice these roles. These were not, as some lurid accounts suggest, brothels, but rather sophisticated training facilities where women could learn and practice the skills they would need for infiltration operations. Older women who had served as operatives in their youth often became trainers and handlers, passing on their knowledge and experience to the next generation. These veteran operatives understood the unique challenges that female intelligence work presented, could provide guidance and support that male handlers might not fully appreciate. Female operatives faced dangers that went beyond the ordinary risks of intelligence work. If discovered, they were vulnerable to sexual violence in ways that male operatives were not. The Koga clans took this reality seriously, training female operatives in self-defense techniques and providing them with means of suicide if capture seemed inevitable. Not out of any romanticized notion of honor, but as a pragmatic measure to prevent torture and forced betrayal. But the work was not all about manipulation and seduction. Female operatives also served as couriers, carrying messages between allied forces or between operatives in the field and their handlers. Women traveling alone or in small groups attracted less attention than men would. A woman could claim to be visiting family, making a pilgrimage, or traveling to seek medical treatment. All plausible covers that would be questioned less than equivalent excuses from a man. Female operatives also served as support personnel for male operatives on missions. They might maintain safe houses, provide medical treatment, create and maintain cover identities, handle logistics and supply chains. These support roles were unglamorous, but absolutely essential for successful operations. Some of the most remarkable stories from Koga history involve women who served as both operatives and leaders. The historical record is frustratingly sparse on specifics. Women's contributions were often deliberately minimized or erased in official histories, but fragments survive. One account mentions a woman referred to only as the Lady of Koga, who served as a senior advisor to the Confederation Council during the early 1500s. She had apparently served as an operative in her youth, had been responsible for several significant intelligence coups, and had earned such respect that her voice carried weight in strategic discussions. The account is maddeningly vague about details, but the very fact that it exists suggests that women's leadership, while unusual, was not unthinkable in Koga society. Another fragmentary account describes a female operative who spent 3 years embedded in the household of a rival daimyo, rising to become a trusted attendant to the lord's wife. When war broke out between her employer and the daimyo, she was able to provide detailed intelligence about the castle's defenses, the lord's military plans, and, critically, the existence of a secret escape tunnel. This intelligence allowed her employer's forces to capture the castle with minimal casualties, ending a campaign that might otherwise have dragged on for months. The role of women in ninja families extended beyond active intelligence work. In households where men might be away for months on missions, women managed properties, maintained business covers, ensured that farms remained productive, and raised children. They were the stable core around which the operational elements of the clan revolved. These women also served as keepers of family traditions and techniques. Much of ninja knowledge was passed down orally rather than in written form, and women played crucial roles in this transmission. A mother teaching her daughter to prepare medicines might be passing on knowledge that could save lives on future missions. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter traditional songs might be encoding message ciphers in the lyrics. Women also served as the conscience and restraint of the community. In a profession that involved deception, violence, and morally ambiguous actions, the steady presence of women who maintained farms, raised children, and preserved normal life provided an anchor, a reminder of what the operatives were ultimately working to protect. The most effective ninja families were those that fully utilized the capabilities of all their members, regardless of gender. The Mochizuki family, one of the most respected Koga clans, was particularly known for training female operatives to a standard equal to their male counterparts. The family head during the early 1500s, Mochizuki Izumo, was said to have been trained partly by his mother, who had herself been a legendary operative in her time. The Koga approach to female operatives was pragmatic rather than ideological. They were not making statements about gender equality or women's rights. These were not concepts that would have made sense in 16th century Japan. They were simply recognizing that women could do things men could not, could access places men could not reach, and that failing to utilize these capabilities would be a waste of valuable resources. This pragmatism produced a system where women had more opportunities, more autonomy, and more respect than they would have enjoyed in more conventional parts of Japanese society. It was not equality in any modern sense, but it was a recognition of capability and value that was unusual for its time. As we move forward through Koga history, we will see women continuing to play important roles, though often their contributions will be visible only in glimpses, in fragmentary records, in stories that survived despite systemic biases that worked to erase or minimize them. The true extent of women's involvement in ninja activities will never be fully known, but what we do know suggests that the history we have is incomplete, that there are stories waiting to be rediscovered about women who moved through shadows and shaped events in ways that official histories overlooked. But ninja, male and female, did not operate in isolation from the broader religious and philosophical currents of their time. The mountains of Koga were home not only to warrior families, but also to Buddhist temples and monasteries, and the relationship between religious institutions and the ninja clans was complex, influential, and sometimes surprising. Chapter 10. The Warrior Monks and Sacred Knowledge. The mountains surrounding the Koga Valley were dotted with Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, sacred spaces that predated the ninja families and existed in complex relationship with them. To understand the full story of Koga, we must understand these religious dimensions, for they shaped the philosophy, training, and legitimacy of the ninja tradition in ways that pure martial history cannot explain. Mountain Temple Complex at dawn, mist surrounding wooden structures, stone pathways leading upward. Buddhism had come to Japan in the 6th century and had spread throughout the archipelago, taking on distinctive Japanese characteristics while retaining core teachings. By the medieval period, Buddhist temples were not only religious centers, but also major political and economic powers, owning vast estates, maintaining armed forces, and engaging in political intrigue that would not have seemed out of place among the daimyo. The temples of Mount Hiei near Kyoto were particularly famous, or infamous, for their warrior monks, the Sohei. These were not gentle contemplatives, but hardened fighters who trained in martial arts alongside their religious studies, who defended temple lands with the same ferocity that samurai defended their lord's domains. There were connections between these warrior monk traditions and the development of ninjutsu. Some of the families that eventually settled in Koga traced their origins to temple communities, to monks who had left religious life for various reasons, but retained the martial skills and philosophical teachings they had learned. The influence of Buddhist thought on ninja philosophy was profound and persistent. One of the core Buddhist concepts that resonated with ninja practice was the idea of impermanence, that all things are temporary, that attachment leads to suffering, that the wise person maintains equanimity in the face of changing circumstances. For operatives who might need to abandon identities, who watched friends die, who could never be certain whether their next mission would be their last, this teaching provided psychological framework for coping with an extraordinarily stressful life. Buddhist meditation hall, seated figures in meditation posture, incense smoke rising. Buddhist meditation practices were integrated into ninja training. Operatives learned techniques for calming the mind, for maintaining focus under stress, for managing fear and pain. These were not abstract spiritual exercises, but practical tools for survival. An operative who could control their breathing and heart rate through meditation could remain calm during infiltrations, could hide for hours in uncomfortable positions without fidgeting, could maintain clarity of thought in situations that would cause others to panic. The Buddhist concept of upaya, skillful means, also influenced ninja philosophy. Upaya teaches that the wise person adapts their approach to the situation and the audience, that there is no single right way to achieve liberation, but rather many paths suited to different temperaments and circumstances. For ninja, this translated into tactical flexibility, into the willingness to use whatever methods the situation required, rather than being bound by rigid protocols. But the relationship between ninja and Buddhism went beyond philosophy to include practical connections with specific temples. Several temples in the Koga region served as training grounds, meeting places, and even cover identities for ninja operations. The Temple of Chonjiji, located in the mountains above the valley, maintained close ties with several Koga families. Monks from this temple were known to travel extensively, ostensibly on pilgrimages or to visit affiliated temples, but sometimes serving as couriers or intelligence gatherers for the confederation. The temple's neutral status gave its monks access to places that would be closed to known ninja, and their religious role provided perfect cover for gathering information. Management relationship was mutually beneficial. The Koga families provided protection and financial support to the temple. In return, the temple provided sanctuary when needed, maintained secure communication networks, and occasionally trained selected members of ninja families in advanced meditation and martial techniques preserved from ancient times. Some ninja operatives even posed as monks on extended missions, using religious identity as cover for intelligence gathering. This required genuine knowledge of Buddhist scripture, ritual, and practice. An operative who could not convincingly perform religious ceremonies or discuss doctrine would quickly be exposed. The Koga clans maintained deep knowledge of Buddhism, not only for philosophical reasons, but as practical tradecraft. Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, also influenced ninja culture. Shinto's emphasis on natural forces, on spirits dwelling in mountains, rivers, and forests, resonated with families who lived in close connection with the landscape. Many Koga families maintained small shrines on their properties, dedicated to local deities or to ancestral spirits. The Shinto concept of kami, spirits or divine forces present in nature, shaped how ninja understood their relationship with their environment. The mountains were not just terrain to be traversed, but living presences, kami who might protect or threaten, depending on how they were approached. Operatives would sometimes offer prayers at shrines before dangerous missions, seeking the favor of local kami. This was not mere superstition, but a way of maintaining psychological readiness and community cohesion. The rituals surrounding missions, the prayers, the offerings, the formal farewells, helped operatives transition mentally from everyday life to the heightened alertness required for dangerous work. They provided structure and meaning to activities that might otherwise seem random or absurd. The blending of Buddhist and Shinto elements produced a distinctive spiritual culture in Koga. It was not systematic theology, but rather a practical spirituality, focused on living well, maintaining harmony with natural and social environments, and facing death with equanimity when it came. Death was ever present in ninja life, and religious teachings helped families cope with loss. When an operative died on a mission, their family would hold Buddhist funeral rites, but also maintain Shinto memorials where the deceased's spirit was honored as an ancestor. These practices helped maintain continuity across generations, reminding the living that they were part of a tradition extending backward into the past and forward into the future. Some religious practices directly supported operational security. Codes and signals might be disguised as religious texts or prayers. Meeting locations could be specified by referring to particular temples or shrines. Religious festivals provided cover for gatherings that might otherwise arouse suspicion. When hundreds of people were traveling to attend a temple ceremony, a few more faces would not be noticed. The temples also served as repositories of knowledge. Before the development of systematic written records, much of ninja technique and history was preserved orally, but some was written down and kept in temple archives where it would be safe from casual discovery. These documents were written in coded language, appearing to be religious texts to anyone not trained to read them properly. The relationship between religious institutions and ninja families was not without tension. Some Buddhist schools taught strict ethical codes that were difficult to reconcile with activities like espionage and assassination. There were debates within both communities about whether ninja work was compatible with Buddhist principles of non-violence and compassion. These debates were never fully resolved, but a kind of working accommodation emerged. Ninja saw themselves as necessary in a world of violence, as people who took on morally ambiguous work so that others could live in relative peace. They strove to minimize unnecessary harm, to target their actions as precisely as possible, to avoid gratuitous cruelty. They told themselves, and many seemed to genuinely believe, that their work prevented greater violence and suffering. The Buddhist teachers who worked with ninja families generally did not challenge this self-understanding directly. Instead, they emphasized the importance of right intention, of acting from necessity rather than malice, of maintaining compassion even toward enemies. They taught that karma was complex, that actions could not be judged solely by their visible effects, that the state of mind of the actor mattered as much as the act itself. So this philosophical framework allowed ninja to integrate their work with their spiritual lives without requiring them to either abandon their profession or pretend that their actions were without moral weight. It was a pragmatic accommodation to a difficult reality, neither purely cynical nor naively idealistic. As the 16th century progressed and the Sengoku period intensified, these religious and philosophical resources would be tested. The Koga Ninja would face choices that challenged their self-understanding, situations where their usual ethical frameworks provided no clear guidance. They would need to decide who they were willing to serve, what they were willing to do, where lines existed that they would not cross. But before we reach those moments of crisis, we must understand how the Koga Confederation integrated itself into the larger political landscape of Sengoku Japan. We must see how they navigated relationships with the powerful warlords who might be their employers today and their enemies tomorrow. How they maintained their independence while operating in an environment where independence was a luxury few could afford. Chapter 11. Service to the shoguns. The political landscape of 16th century Japan was a labyrinth of shifting alliances, competing ambitions, and existential uncertainties. The Ashikaga shogunate, which had nominally ruled Japan from Kyoto since 1336, was a shadow of its former power. Real authority rested with provincial warlords, the daimyo, who controlled their domains as semi-independent kingdoms and competed constantly for advantage. For the Koga Confederation, navigating this environment required extraordinary political skill. They needed to maintain working relationships with multiple, often opposing powers. They needed to be valuable enough to protect themselves from conquest, but not so threatening as to become targets themselves. They needed to maintain their autonomy while acknowledging the realities of power. The Koga strategy was fundamentally pragmatic. They would serve whoever could pay, but they maintained certain principles. Contracts, once accepted, would be honored. Confidential information would not be revealed. They would not serve two opposing sides in the same conflict simultaneously. That would destroy the trust that was their most valuable asset. One of their most important relationships was with the Rokaku clan, who controlled significant territory immediately adjacent to the Koga Valley. The Rokaku were powerful enough to be a serious threat if they chose to conquer Koga, but they were also pragmatic enough to recognize that Koga's services were more valuable than its land. An informal arrangement developed. The Koga Confederation would provide intelligence services and specialized operations for the Rokaku at preferential rates. In return, the Rokaku would not attempt to directly control Koga, would protect it from other powers who might covet it, and would facilitate Koga operatives' ability to travel through Rokaku territory. This relationship was formalized through a series of contracts and agreements negotiated over many years. It was not vassalage in the traditional sense. The Koga families did not swear loyalty to the Rokaku lord, did not provide military service as feudal obligation. It was instead a business relationship, renewable and renegotiable, that served both parties' interests. But the Koga also maintained relationships with other powers, including some who were rivals or enemies of the Rokaku. This required careful management and clear communication. When accepting a contract from a Rokaku rival, the Koga would typically inform the Rokaku through back channels, making clear that the mission would not directly target Rokaku interests. This transparency helped maintain trust, even while serving technically opposing clients. The Ashikaga shoguns in Kyoto were another important client. Despite their declining power, the shoguns still commanded prestige and influence. They still needed intelligence about the activities of powerful daimyo who might threaten what remained of shogunal authority. The Koga provided these services, seeing them as relatively low risk. Gathering information about daimyo movements and plans rarely required direct action that might provoke retaliation. Payment for these services took various forms. Sometimes it was direct payment in gold or silver. Other times it might be rice, the basis of the agricultural economy, which could be consumed or traded. Still other times, payment might come as trading privileges, access to restricted goods, safe conduct passes that allowed operatives to move freely through territories that would otherwise be closed to them. Coins, rice bags, official documents with seals. The Confederation carefully managed the distribution of these payments, ensuring that families who undertook more dangerous missions received larger shares, but also that all families benefited from the contracts won by their colleagues. This system maintained cohesion and prevented the kind of dangerous internal competition that might have fractured the Confederation. As the middle decades of the 16th century unfolded, a new power began to emerge that would eventually reshape all of Japan. Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was a minor daimyo from Owari province who possessed extraordinary military genius, ruthless ambition, and willingness to embrace innovations, including the use of firearms on a scale unprecedented in Japanese warfare. Nobunaga's rise would have profound implications for the Koga Ninja, but in the earlier stages of his career, he was simply another client, another ambitious warlord who recognized the value of good intelligence. The Koga provided services to Nobunaga just as they did to others, not yet realizing that this particular client would eventually hold the power to destroy them if he chose. During the 1550s and 1560s, as Nobunaga consolidated his power and began his march toward Kyoto, the Koga Confederation found itself increasingly drawn into the great conflicts of the era. Nobunaga employed both Koga and Iga operatives, playing them off against each other, using the rivalry between the communities to ensure competitive service and moderate prices. This was a dangerous game. The more dependent the ninja communities became on a single powerful employer, the more leverage that employer had over them. But the Koga tried to maintain some diversification, continuing to serve other clients even as Nobunaga's star rose. One of the most significant operations involving Koga Ninja during this period was intelligence gathering prior to the Battle of Okehazama in 1560. Nobunaga, with a tiny force of perhaps 3,000 men, faced an army of 25,000 under Imagawa Yoshimoto. Conventional military wisdom said Nobunaga had no chance. But Nobunaga had intelligence, detailed information about Imagawa's route of march, his army's disposition, the location of his headquarters, even the fact that the Imagawa forces had celebrated their anticipated victory by drinking heavily the night before the battle. This intelligence came from operatives, likely including some from Koga, who had infiltrated or observed the Imagawa forces. Armed with this information, Nobunaga launched a surprise attack directly at Imagawa's headquarters during a thunderstorm. The attack succeeded spectacularly. Imagawa was killed, his army routed. Nobunaga's victory at Okehazama announced him as a major power and began his rise to dominance. The Koga Ninja could take some satisfaction in having contributed to this historic upset, but they also understood the implications. Nobunaga was now more powerful, more dangerous, more capable of shaping events. And he was a man who remembered debts and expected loyalty from those who served him. Through the 1560s, the relationship between Koga and Nobunaga remained basically positive. The Confederation provided services, received payment, maintained its autonomy. But there were warning signs for those paying attention. Nobunaga was not a man who tolerated opposition or valued traditions that interfered with his ambitions. He had shown willingness to destroy Buddhist temples that resisted him, to massacre communities that defied him, to use overwhelming force against anyone he deemed an enemy. The Koga leadership watched these developments with concern. They increased efforts to maintain relationships with Nobunaga's rivals, seeking to ensure they would have options if the relationship with Nobunaga soured. They also strengthened their defenses, improving fortifications throughout the valley, stockpiling weapons and supplies, preparing for the possibility that they might need to defend their homeland. But they also continued to serve Nobunaga, continued to send operatives on missions that supported his campaigns. They were caught in the classic dilemma of small powers in proximity to great ones. Too valuable to ignore, but too vulnerable to defy. The other great power of this era was Tokugawa Ieyasu, who began his career as an ally and subordinate of Nobunaga, but would eventually become the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule Japan for 2.5 centuries. Ieyasu's relationship with the ninja communities, particularly with Iga, would become famous, but he also employed Koga operatives and understood their value. Ieyasu was a more patient, more careful leader than Nobunaga. Where Nobunaga was bold and aggressive, Ieyasu was calculating and cautious. Where Nobunaga made enemies carelessly, Ieyasu built alliances carefully. The ninja who served both men noted these differences and had their own preferences, though they kept those preferences private, understanding that expressing political opinions about employers was dangerous. As the 1560s gave way to the 1570s, the Koga Confederation stood at a crossroads. The services they provided were in higher demand than ever. Their reputation was at its peak. Yet the world around them was changing in ways that threatened the very foundations of their existence. The great unifiers, first Nobunaga, then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, finally Tokugawa Ieyasu, were creating a new Japan, a unified Japan. A Japan where autonomous regions and independent military powers would not be tolerated. Peaceful, but with subtle signs of preparation and concern. The question facing Koga was whether they could adapt to this new reality, whether they could find a place in the emerging order, or whether their very nature, independent, autonomous, loyal to themselves rather than to great lords, would make them incompatible with the Japan that was being born. The answer would come in violence and fire, in a conflict that would devastate both Koga and their rivals in Iga, that would nearly destroy both communities, and that would forever change what it meant to be a ninja in Japan. But before we reach that terrible climax, we must understand how the relationship between Koga and Iga evolved during these crucial decades, how rivalry turned to crisis, and how both communities found themselves on a collision course that neither had wanted or foreseen. Chapter 12. The Great Rivalry's Turning Point. The relationship between Koga and Iga had always been complex. Part rivalry, part respect, occasionally cooperative, but fundamentally competitive. Through the mid-16th century, this relationship had been manageable, even productive. Competition drove both communities to excellence. But as the political landscape shifted and the stakes grew higher, the rivalry began to take on darker tones. The spark that would ignite conflict came not from within the ninja communities themselves, but from outside forces that sought to exploit their rivalry. In 1570, a mid-ranking daimyo named Kitabatake Tomonori, whose territory bordered both Koga and Iga, found himself threatened by more powerful neighbors. Rather than face his enemies directly, he conceived a plan to weaken them by setting Koga and Iga against each other. Kitabatake approached the Koga Confederation with what appeared to be a straightforward contract: gather intelligence on certain daimyo who threatened his domain. He simultaneously approached Iga leaders with a similar contract, but the targets he assigned to each community included the other community's traditional employers and allies. He was essentially hiring Koga to spy on Iga's clients and vice versa, knowing that this would create tensions and potential confrontations. The more sophisticated leaders in both communities recognized the manipulation, but by the time they understood what was happening, younger and more hot-headed operatives had already clashed. A Koga team conducting surveillance in territory where Iga had interests was discovered by Iga operatives. In the confrontation that followed, 2 Koga Ninja were killed. The Koga Confederation demanded compensation and an apology. Iga, arguing that their operatives had acted in legitimate defense of their mission, refused. The dispute escalated. Families on both sides began calling for revenge, for teaching the rivals a lesson they would not forget. The leadership of both communities tried to contain the situation. Koga Saburo, now elderly but still influential, sent messages to his counterparts in Iga proposing mediation. But the internal politics of both confederations made de-escalation difficult. Families who advocated compromise were accused of cowardice by more aggressive factions. The memory of past slights and grievances was invoked. The competitive pride that had long driven both communities to excellence now drove them toward confrontation.
Over the next 2 years, the situation deteriorated. There were more clashes, more casualties. Contracts were sabotaged, operatives were ambushed, safe houses were burned. The violence was still controlled. Neither community wanted full-scale war, but it was increasingly difficult to tell where the line was that should not be crossed. In 1572, that line was crossed. A prominent member of the Mochizuki family, one of Koga's leading clans, was assassinated in what was clearly a professional operation, bearing the hallmarks of Iga techniques. Whether this was sanctioned by Iga leadership or carried out by rogue operatives seeking revenge for earlier Koga actions was unclear. But the effect was the same. Koga could not let such an act stand unanswered without appearing weak, without inviting further attacks. The Koga Confederation assembled its largest military force in generations, perhaps 500 men, a substantial army by the standards of the ninja communities. The objective was not to conquer Iga, but to deliver a punitive strike, to demonstrate that Koga would defend its members, to hopefully shock Iga into negotiations. Torches, determination mixed with apprehension on faces. The Koga force struck at several Iga targets simultaneously, compounds of families that Koga believed were responsible for the assassination, training facilities, supply depots. The attacks were successful from a military perspective. Koga operatives demonstrated that they could penetrate Iga's defenses, could strike at the heart of their rivals' territory. But the operation did not produce the intended strategic effect. Rather than suing for peace, Iga mobilized for war. The 3 great clans of Iga put aside their own rivalries and organized a massive retaliation. In early 1573, an Iga force of comparable size struck into Koga territory. The resulting conflict was not the stealthy, surgical operations that ninja were known for. It was brutal, close-quarters combat, as Koga defenders fought to protect their homes and families. The fighting lasted for days. Villages burned. Civilians died alongside combatants. The mountains echoed with sounds of battle. Eventually, exhaustion and the recognition that both sides were bleeding themselves for no good purpose led to a cessation of hostilities. Neither community had achieved victory. Both had suffered losses they could ill afford. The infrastructure of training facilities, safe houses, and supply networks that had taken generations to build had been damaged or destroyed. Mediation was finally arranged through Buddhist temples that had connections with both communities.
The settlement that emerged from these negotiations was less a peace treaty than an armed truce. Both sides agreed to cease hostilities, to respect each other's territories, to avoid contracts that would put them in direct conflict. But the underlying issues were not resolved, and the resentment ran deep. Families returning to burned homes, atmosphere of exhaustion and loss. The 1572 to 1573 conflict had profound effects on both communities. Militarily, they had demonstrated their capabilities, but also their vulnerabilities. The mystique of invincibility that had partially protected them, the belief that attacking ninja communities would be prohibitively costly, had been damaged. They had shown that they could be hurt, could be forced to fight defensive battles on their home ground. Politically, the conflict weakened both communities at the worst possible time. Oda Nobunaga was advancing toward Kyoto, consolidating control over central Japan. He watched the ninja communities tear each other apart and drew his own conclusions about their reliability and their threat level. Economically, the damage was severe. Resources that should have gone to training and equipping operatives had been consumed in mutual destruction. Contracts had been lost as employers questioned whether the ninja communities could be trusted to focus on their missions rather than on their feuds. Young operatives who should have been learning their trade had instead learned to hate and fear their counterparts across the mountains. The psychological impact was perhaps most profound. The code that governed ninja communities held that their greatest strength was their unity, their reliability, their professionalism. They were supposed to be above the kind of blood feuds and honor-driven violence that consumed the samurai class. Yet they had fallen into exactly that trap, allowing pride and anger to override pragmatism and common sense. Elderly leaders from both communities in solemn discussion, acknowledgement of mistakes and losses. In the aftermath of the conflict, reformers in both communities argued that fundamental changes were needed. The rivalry between Koga and Iga had become destructive rather than constructive. Either it needed to be ended entirely, with the communities merging or at least coordinating closely, or it needed to be rigidly controlled, with mechanisms in place to prevent disputes from escalating to violence. But institutional reform is always difficult, especially in decentralized organizations where authority is diffuse and consensus is required for major decisions. The reforms that were implemented were partial and incomplete. Both communities strengthened their internal discipline, making it harder for rogue operatives to launch unauthorized actions. They established better communication channels to resolve disputes before they escalated. But they did not fundamentally reshape the competitive dynamic that had led to conflict. And they did not have much time. Even as they were recovering from their self-inflicted wounds, the great wave that would nearly destroy them both was building. Oda Nobunaga had taken Kyoto in 1568 and was systematically eliminating opposition throughout central Japan. He had no tolerance for autonomous military powers, for communities that claimed the right to make their own decisions about whom to serve and how. The ninja communities, weakened by their conflict, distracted by recovery efforts, did not fully appreciate how much danger they were in. They continued to provide services to Nobunaga, continued to believe that their value would protect them. They did not understand that to Nobunaga, their autonomy was more important than their utility, that he would rather destroy a useful tool than allow it to remain outside his control. The crisis would come first for Iga. In 1579, Nobunaga's son attempted to invade Iga province and was bloodily repulsed. The Iga Ninja demonstrated their formidable defensive capabilities, inflicting heavy casualties on a force that outnumbered them significantly. They had won a military victory, had preserved their autonomy, but they had made a permanent enemy of the most powerful man in Japan. For Koga, watching from across the mountains, the implications were terrifying. If Nobunaga would attack Iga, who had served him loyally, who had provided valuable intelligence and operations, then no ninja community was safe. The autonomy that Koga prized, that had been the foundation of their existence, was on a collision course with Nobunaga's vision of a unified, centrally controlled Japan. The Koga Confederation faced an agonizing choice: submit fully to Nobunaga, abandoning the independence that defined them, or prepare to share Iga's fate. Neither option was acceptable. Yet choosing nothing, maintaining the status quo, was itself a choice that was becoming increasingly untenable. In the end, different Koga families made different choices, and those choices would determine who survived the coming storm and who did not. But before we follow the Koga Ninja into their darkest hour, we must understand the loyalty and values that guided them, the codes that gave meaning to their dangerous lives, and the question of what it means to serve in an age of universal betrayal. Chapter 13. Loyalty in an Age of Betrayal. The concept of loyalty in Sengoku period Japan was both paramount and paradoxical. It was the supreme virtue, celebrated in countless stories and songs, yet it was also constantly violated, as samurai betrayed lords, lords betrayed alliances, and everyone navigated a world where yesterday's ally was today's enemy. Two figures in traditional dress exchanging ceremonial cups in formal alliance ritual. Serious atmosphere. For the Koga Ninja, navigating this landscape of shifting loyalties required a clear internal code, a set of principles that could guide action when external certainties dissolved. The code they developed was distinctive, pragmatic, and, in its own way, honorable. The first principle was loyalty to family and community above all else. An operative might serve many employers over a career, but their ultimate loyalty was to their clan, to the 53 families of Koga, to the valley that was their home. This primary loyalty provided an anchor, a reference point that remained constant even as everything else changed. The second principle was that contracts, once accepted, must be honored. A ninja who betrayed an employer, who revealed secrets or failed to complete missions, damaged not only their own reputation, but that of their entire family and community. The Koga Confederation's ability to command high prices for their services depended on trust, on the knowledge that when you hired Koga, the job would be done and confidentiality would be maintained. This principle was tested constantly. Operatives might be offered bribes to betray their current employer. They might discover that their employer's cause was unjust, that completing their mission would lead to outcomes they found morally troubling. They might face personal danger that could be avoided by abandoning the mission. The code was clear. Absent extraordinary circumstances that the Confederation's leadership acknowledged as legitimately releasing you from obligation, you completed the mission. Personal feelings, moral qualms, better offers, none of these excused breach of contract. Operative in shadows facing difficult choice, internal conflict visible in posture. But the code also recognized that not all contracts should be accepted.
The Koga Confederation refused missions that would require them to target each other, that would put different Koga families in direct conflict. They generally avoided missions that would require betraying previous employers with whom they had maintained long-term relationships, understanding that being known as turncoats would ultimately damage their reputation. They also tried to avoid missions that seemed designed primarily to test their loyalty, rather than to achieve legitimate objectives. When powerful employers would sometimes offer contracts that seemed designed to force ninja communities to prove their subservience, the Koga response was often to decline politely, claiming other commitments or suggesting that other communities might be better suited to the work. This required careful judgment and sometimes resulted in lost revenue, but the leadership understood that maintaining autonomy and self-respect was more important than maximizing income. A community that would do literally anything for money would eventually become simply a tool of the powerful, rather than an independent actor. The third principle of the code concerned treatment of non-combatants and unnecessary violence. The Koga Ninja were not squeamish about killing when missions required it, but they distinguished between necessary and unnecessary harm, between legitimate targets and innocent bystanders. An operative who killed guards to complete an infiltration mission was doing their job. An operative who killed servants or civilians who happened to be in the way was creating unnecessary problems and violating the code. Not only was gratuitous violence wrong in itself, it also created complications. investigations, revenge killings, escalating cycles of violence that made future operations more difficult. This principle was tested when missions involved targeting leaders who were personally admirable, or when completing missions would lead to outcomes that the operative found troubling. The code's guidance here was clear, but not simple. Your personal feelings about the justice of a mission should be considered before accepting the contract, not during its execution. Once committed, you completed the work. If you could not do that in good conscience, you should have declined the contract in the first place. This might seem to place all the moral weight on the moment of accepting or declining contracts, and in a sense, it did.
The Koga Confederation spent considerable time debating which contracts to accept, trying to foresee consequences, weighing not just payment, but also alignment with the community's longer-term interests and values. The fourth principle concerned treatment of fellow ninja, including rivals from Iga. Even when Koga and Iga were in conflict, there were boundaries that were not supposed to be crossed. Captured operatives were to be treated according to established protocols. Interrogated, certainly, but not subjected to gratuitous torture or humiliation. Families of ninja killed in operations were not to be targeted for revenge. These rules were honored imperfectly, especially during the heat of the 1572-1573 conflict. But they existed, and were generally respected, representing a recognition that ninja communities, however competitive, had more in common with each other than with the samurai and daimyo they served. The fifth principle concerned information security and the protection of techniques. Koga operatives were trained never to reveal operational methods, never to discuss missions with anyone outside the Confederation, never to allow capture of documents or materials that might compromise future operations. This principle was absolute. An operative facing capture was expected to destroy any compromising materials they carried, and to commit suicide if necessary to prevent interrogation. This was not a romanticized notion of honor, but a practical measure to protect the community. One operative's information, extracted under torture, could compromise dozens of other operatives and ongoing missions. The tools for suicide were part of the standard kit: a concealed blade, a poison, something that could be used quickly when there was no other option. Operatives trained to reach these tools reflexively, to use them before captors could prevent it. The training was grim but necessary, an acknowledgement that the work they had chosen might require the ultimate sacrifice. The sixth principle concerned treatment of other Koga families and maintenance of the Confederation. Internal disputes were to be resolved through mediation rather than violence. Resources were to be shared equitably. Success was to be celebrated collectively rather than hoarded individually. This principle of internal solidarity was what made the Confederation work. In a profession where external loyalties were constantly shifting, where trust was a scarce commodity, the knowledge that fellow Koga families could be relied upon was precious. It was the foundation on which everything else rested. But principles, however clearly articulated, are tested by circumstances. As the 1570s progressed and Oda Nobunaga's power grew, the Koga Confederation faced situations that would strain their code to its limits. Tense 1575, Nobunaga achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Nagashino, destroying the Takeda clan's cavalry through innovative use of firearms. The message was clear. The old ways of warfare were dying. Innovation, organization, and ruthless application of force were the future. Traditional martial values, autonomous military powers, communities that claimed the right to make their own decisions, all were obstacles to be swept aside. The Koga Confederation watched these developments with growing alarm. They began to receive contracts from Nobunaga that felt less like employment and more like tests of loyalty. They were asked to provide intelligence on their other employers, to participate in operations against communities with whom they had long-standing relationships, to accept payment terms that were less generous than in the past. Some families argued for full submission to Nobunaga, for abandoning any pretense of autonomy and offering themselves as his exclusive servants. Better to survive as subordinates than to be destroyed for prideful insistence on independence. Others argued for resistance, for preparing to fight if necessary, for coordinating with Iga and other threatened communities to present a united front against Nobunaga's aggression. Still others argued for a middle path, appear to submit while maintaining actual autonomy, do the minimum necessary to avoid provoking Nobunaga while preserving the essence of what made Koga distinctive. The confederation could not reach consensus. Different families pursued different strategies, each believing their approach offered the best chance of survival. This fragmentation of purpose would prove nearly fatal when crisis finally came. In 1579, when Nobunaga's son attacked Iga and was repulsed, the Koga Confederation faced a moment of decision. Should they support Iga against common enemy, honoring the ancient bonds between ninja communities? Should they remain neutral, hoping to avoid Nobunaga's wrath? Should they actively support Nobunaga against Iga, demonstrating loyalty and hoping to be rewarded? The Confederation chose neutrality, a decision that satisfied no one and protected no one. It alienated Iga without satisfying Nobunaga. It preserved autonomy in the short term, while ensuring that when Nobunaga's hammer eventually fell, Koga would face it alone. In the aftermath of this decision, Koga Saburo, who had led the Confederation through earlier crises, died. Whether from natural causes or from the stress and despair of watching his life's work crumble is unclear. His death removed one of the few leaders with the authority and vision to unite the fractious families. The stage was set for catastrophe. Nobunaga had decided that autonomous ninja communities were intolerable. The Koga Confederation was divided and leaderless, and in 1581, Nobunaga would finally move against Iga with overwhelming force. Not raiding, but invasion. Not seeking to control, but to destroy. Koga would watch this unfold from across the mountains, knowing that if Iga fell, they would be next. Yet unable to agree on how to respond, paralyzed by fear and dissension. The greatest test of their existence was coming, and they would face it unprepared. Their legendary skills and carefully cultivated reputation no match for the simple mathematics of overwhelming force applied without mercy. Chapter 14. The Long Decline. The year 1581 marked the beginning of the end for autonomous ninja communities in central Japan. In September of that year, Oda Nobunaga launched his second invasion of Iga province, and this time there would be no repulse, no victory against the odds. Nobunaga committed a force of more than 40,000 men, an army larger than most used to conquer entire provinces, to crush a community of perhaps a few thousand ninja and their families. Nobunaga was not a military campaign in the conventional sense. It was systematic annihilation. Nobunaga's forces surrounded Iga from multiple directions, preventing escape. They burned villages methodically. They killed not just combatants, but families, children, anyone associated with the ninja community. They destroyed training facilities, temples that had supported ninja families, farms and workshops. The Iga ninja fought with desperate courage. They used every trick, every technique they had developed over generations. They set ambushes, collapsed paths behind advancing troops, used fire and explosives to create chaos. They inflicted casualties disproportionate to their numbers. But courage and skill cannot overcome overwhelming numerical superiority and strategic encirclement. The Iga resistance was ground down systematically. Within weeks, organized opposition had ceased. The survivors fled in small groups, seeking refuge wherever they could find it. Some fled to Koga. Across the mountains came refugees carrying tales of horror, of villages burning, of families destroyed, of a way of life ending in blood and ash. The Koga Confederation faced an agonizing decision: provide sanctuary to Iga refugees, knowing this would anger Nobunaga, or turn away people who shared their profession and their culture to preserve their own precarious safety. Exhausted, traumatized, families helping them despite visible fear. Different Koga families made different choices. Some provided shelter, either from compassion or from calculation that the survivors' knowledge and skills would strengthen Koga. Others turned refugees away, afraid of association with Nobunaga's enemies. The Confederation as a whole could not agree on a unified policy. Nobunaga watched these developments and drew conclusions. Koga's divided response confirmed his assessment that the ninja communities could not be relied upon, could not be trusted, had to be eliminated, or brought completely under control. In late 1581, Nobunaga sent representatives to Koga with an ultimatum: submit completely to his authority, provide hostages to ensure compliance, accept his garrisons in the valley, or face the same fate as Iga. There would be no negotiation, no middle ground. The Koga Confederation descended into crisis. The family heads met in emergency council and argued for days. The factions that had emerged over the past years, those favoring submission, those favoring resistance, those hoping for middle paths, now had to make definitive choices. The submission faction pointed to Iga's fate. Resistance was suicide. Better to accept Nobunaga's terms, preserve what could be preserved, and hope that in time they might regain some autonomy as the political situation changed. The resistance faction argued that submission would destroy them more surely than resistance. If they accepted Nobunaga's terms, they would become slaves rather than ninja. Their skills would be used at his whim. Their families would be hostages to ensure compliance, and eventually they would be discarded when no longer useful. The Confederation fractured. About 1/3 of the families, led by some of the most prominent clans, chose submission. They sent representatives to Nobunaga accepting his terms, offering hostages, opening their territories to his forces. Another third chose resistance. They prepared defenses, stockpiled weapons, sent their families into the deep mountains, and waited for the attack they knew would come. The final third chose escape. They abandoned their lands, dispersed their families, and fled to distant provinces where Nobunaga's power did not yet reach. Some went to northern Japan, some to the west, some even to the island of Kyushu at Japan's southern tip. This fragmentation ensured that no choice would be fully effective. The families that submitted found that Nobunaga's promises of preservation were hollow. They were stripped of their autonomy. Their techniques were appropriated, their children were conscripted, and their lands were given to more reliable retainers. They had surrendered everything for a safety that proved illusory. The families that resisted faced attack, but not the overwhelming assault that had destroyed Iga. Nobunaga was now dealing with a divided community, part of which had submitted. A full-scale invasion was unnecessary. Instead, he sent smaller forces to eliminate specific families, to burn specific compounds, to make examples that would intimidate others. The resistance families fought skillfully, inflicting casualties and occasionally achieving local victories. but they were fighting a war of attrition they could not win. One by one, resistance strongholds fell. Families were scattered, their compounds destroyed, their histories erased. Nobunaga that fled preserved themselves, but lost their home. Scattered across Japan, living as refugees or trying to establish themselves in unfamiliar territories, they could no longer function as Koga Ninja. They might retain individual skills, might even find employment as operatives for local lords, but the community, the confederation, the accumulated knowledge and tradition, all that was lost. Then, in June 1582, something unexpected happened. Oda Nobunaga was assassinated by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, in the Honnoji incident. The man who had nearly destroyed both Iga and Koga, who had seemed unstoppable in his march toward total control of Japan, was dead, killed by betrayal rather than by any opponent's skill or strength. For the surviving ninja communities, Nobunaga's death brought not relief, but more uncertainty. The power struggle to succeed him involved multiple factions, multiple armies, battles and assassinations, and constantly shifting alliances. In this chaos, there was no clarity about what might happen to the remnants of Koga and Iga. Toyotomi Hideyoshi emerged as Nobunaga's successor, and he proved to be even more effective at consolidating power. Hideyoshi completed Nobunaga's unification of Japan, but he did so with more political finesse, with more willingness to co-opt rather than destroy, with more attention to integrating defeated enemies rather than annihilating them. Hideyoshi's approach to the ninja communities was pragmatic. He recognized their skills, but also their threat. His policy was to bring them under control without destroying them completely. He offered survivors a choice: accept employment under his strict terms, effectively becoming his agents rather than independent operators, or retire from ninja activities entirely, returning to farming or other peaceful occupations. Many surviving Koga families accepted these terms. They entered Hideyoshi's service, providing intelligence and special operations for his campaigns. But it was service very different from what their ancestors had known. There was no confederation anymore, no collective decision-making, no autonomy. Individual families served at Hideyoshi's pleasure, and he made clear that any hint of disloyalty would result in extinction. Others chose retirement. They returned to their lands if they still held them, or settled in new territories if they had been displaced. They taught their children to farm, to pursue trades, to avoid attention. The techniques and knowledge they possessed were not written down, not passed on, allowed to fade with their generation. By the 1590s, the Koga Confederation as a political and military entity had ceased to exist. Some families maintained their identity and their connection to the valley. Some preserved elements of their martial traditions, teaching their descendants skills that might no longer have obvious applications. But the era of independent ninja communities operating autonomously was over. The final blow came under Tokugawa Ieyasu, who completed Japan's unification after Hideyoshi's death. Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, beginning 2.5 centuries of peace and rigid social control. In the Tokugawa system, there was no place for autonomous military specialists, for communities that claimed the right to make their own decisions about whom to serve. Ieyasu did employ ninja, particularly from Iga families that had served him personally during his rise to power. But they served as his direct retainers, as parts of his intelligence and security apparatus, with no independence, no collective identity. The famous ninja Hattori Hanzo, who served Ieyasu loyally, was precisely the kind of integrated, dependent specialist that the new order demanded. The Koga families that survived did so by becoming something else. Some became minor samurai families serving Tokugawa or other lords. Others became wealthy farmers or merchants, using organizational skills and connections developed during the ninja era to succeed in peaceful pursuits. Still others simply disappeared into the general population, abandoning even the memory of what their ancestors had been. By the mid-1600s, less than a century after the Confederation's peak, Koga, as a distinct ninja community, had largely faded from active existence. The valley remained, the families remained, but the culture, the practices, the identity that had made them unique were being gradually lost, remembered by fewer people with each passing generation. Yet something persisted. Stories were told, in hushed voices, about the old days. Grandparents taught grandchildren techniques they claimed had been passed down from ninja ancestors, though whether these were authentic or imagined was often unclear. Small shrines in mountain clearings, dedicated to spirits of ancestors who had died on missions, were maintained by families who had long since forgotten exactly who those ancestors were or what those missions had been. The decline of Koga was not a sudden catastrophic collapse, but a gradual fading, a slow forgetting, communities and families adjusting to new realities, making compromises and accommodations, surviving by becoming something other than what they had been. It was the kind of ending that history often provides, not dramatic, but melancholy, not tragic, but sad. The recognition that what was once vibrant and vital has become memory, and that even the memories will eventually fade. Still maintained, but by whom is unclear. But the story does not quite end there, because even as the historical Koga Ninja were fading into the past, they were beginning a second life as legend, as myth, as cultural icon. The real ninja were disappearing, but the idea of ninja was just being born. And that idea would prove far more enduring than the reality ever could have been. Chapter 15. Echoes in the Modern World. The transformation of ninja from historical reality to cultural phenomenon is one of the great ironies of Japanese history. During their actual existence, the Koga and Iga ninja worked in shadows and secrecy, their successes unacknowledged, their failures undiscussed. Yet in the centuries after their decline, they became some of the most famous figures of Japanese culture, celebrated in countless stories, plays, books, and eventually films. This transformation began during the Edo period, the 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule from 1603 to 1868. This was an era of peace, of rigid social hierarchy, of urban culture and popular entertainment. It was also an era when the samurai class, no longer engaged in constant warfare, began to romanticize its own history, to create idealized versions of the warrior past. In this context, ninja became figures of fascination. No longer threatening, there was no autonomous Koga confederation that might serve rival lords. They could be safely romanticized. Stories about ninja began appearing in popular literature, particularly in the genre of historical adventure tales that flourished in urban centers like Edo, modern Tokyo. These stories bore increasingly tenuous relationships to historical reality. The ninja of popular fiction possessed supernatural powers, the ability to disappear in puffs of smoke, to walk on water, to transform into animals, to read minds. They were portrayed as either ultimate villains, shadowy assassins threatening virtuous samurai, or as righteous avengers using unorthodox methods to achieve justice. The real ninja, pragmatic specialists who used mundane skills in service of whoever would pay, were replaced in popular imagination by fantasies that said more about the desires and fears of audiences than about historical truth. Ironically, some of this mythologization was contributed to by families claiming descent from historical ninja. In the late Edo period and into the Meiji era, 1868 to 1912, as Japan modernized and old social hierarchies dissolved, some families began openly claiming ninja ancestry that they had previously kept quiet. These claims were sometimes authentic, but often exaggerated, or simply invented, as families sought to capitalize on the growing fascination with ninja culture. Some of these families produced documents purporting to be authentic ninja manuals, lists of techniques, philosophical teachings, historical records. The most famous of these are the Bansen Shukai and the Shoninki, compiled in the 17th and 18th centuries respectively. These documents contain valuable information, but they also include material that was fabricated or exaggerated to satisfy contemporary expectations.
Modern scholarship has struggled to separate authentic historical information from later embellishment in these sources.
The task is complicated by the fact that even genuine ninja traditions were transmitted primarily orally, with relatively little written documentation. When written records finally appeared, they were already mixing history, myth, and the compiler's own interpretations. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought further transformation. As Japan opened to the West and began rapid modernization, traditional martial arts became vehicles for preserving cultural identity in the face of Western influence. Many martial arts schools were established during this period, and some claimed lineages stretching back to historical ninja. The authenticity of these lineages is hotly debated. Some schools can document connections to historical ninja families. Others' claims are more dubious, based on fragmentary evidence or simply on assertion. But regardless of historical authenticity, these schools played important roles in preserving and transmitting techniques that might otherwise have been lost. The 20th century brought yet another transformation with the global spread of Japanese martial arts and the explosive growth of popular culture. Ninja became figures of international fascination, appearing in comics, novels, films, and eventually video games. Each medium added its own embellishments to the legend. The ninja of international popular culture bore little resemblance to historical reality. They were portrayed as superhuman fighters, as mystical warriors with magical powers, as exotic figures operating according to codes that combined half-understood Japanese concepts with Western fantasy tropes. Yet even these distorted portrayals preserved something, an acknowledgement that unconventional warfare, intelligence work, and survival skills have value, that not all problems can be solved through direct confrontation, that there are forms of strength that don't rely on overwhelming force. In modern times, the Koga Valley, now part of Koga City in Shiga Prefecture, has embraced its ninja heritage. The city maintains museums dedicated to ninja history, hosts ninja-themed festivals, and attracts tourists interested in authentic and less authentic aspects of ninja culture. The Koga Ninja Village, Koga-ryu Ninjutsu Yashiki, preserves a historic ninja house that belonged to the Mochizuki family, one of the prominent Koga clans.
Visitors can see architectural features designed for defense and escape. Hidden compartments, trap doors, concealed passages. These authentic elements coexist with more theatrical demonstrations and reenactments that cater to popular expectations. Local families still claim descent from the historical ninja clans. Some of these claims are well documented, with family records and artifacts that support the connection. Others are more speculative, based on oral traditions or circumstantial evidence. But the pride in this heritage is genuine,
and efforts to preserve and understand the authentic history, separate from mythology, continue. Modern scholarship on ninja history has grown increasingly sophisticated. Historians have systematically examined primary sources, military records, financial documents, diplomatic correspondence, to piece together what can be actually known about historical ninja communities. This work has revealed a reality more complex and more interesting than the myths, showing ninja as skilled professionals operating within intricate political and economic systems rather than as supernatural warriors or romanticized rebels. The controversy over authentic ninja techniques and lineages continues. Various schools and organizations claim to teach genuine ninjutsu, descended from historical traditions. The Bujinkan organization, founded by Takamatsu Toshitsugu and continued by Hatsumi Masaki, claims connections to multiple historical ninja traditions, including Koga lineages. Other organizations dispute these claims and present their own versions of authentic ninja traditions. Modern martial arts dojo, practitioners' training, mix of traditional and contemporary elements. Evaluating these competing claims is extremely difficult. Historical documentation is sparse. The original traditions were deliberately secretive and often transmitted without written records. Centuries of embellishment, reinterpretation, and invention have complicated the historical record. Even experts disagree about what can be authentically traced to historical ninja communities and what represents later reconstruction or invention. What can be said with certainty is that something real existed. Communities in Koga and Iga that specialized in unconventional warfare, that developed sophisticated techniques for intelligence gathering and covert operations, that organized themselves in distinctive ways and maintained these traditions across generations. The specifics of their techniques, the details of their organization, the extent of their capabilities, these remain partially obscured by the passage of time and by centuries of myth-making. For the families in the Koga Valley who maintain connection to this history, the relationship between authentic heritage and popular mythology is complex. They are proud of their ancestors' real achievements, the organizational sophistication, the professional ethics, the survival skills that allowed small communities to maintain autonomy in ages of violence. But they also benefit from the tourism and attention that mythologized ninja culture attracts. This tension between authenticity and commerce, between historical truth and entertaining fiction, is perhaps inevitable when dealing with subjects that capture popular imagination as powerfully as ninja do. The challenge is to honor genuine history, while acknowledging that myths and legends also have value, that stories about ninja, even inaccurate stories, can convey truths about human creativity, about adaptation and survival, about the appeal of unconventional thinking. In recent years, there have been efforts to develop more sophisticated public understanding of ninja history. Yeah,